On a frozen Saturday morning in the American Midwest, a 10-year-old boy walked into a roadside diner full of bikers and held up a crayon map that would tear open every buried secret in the county. His name was Matt Mercer. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His mother had been missing for 6 weeks, and every single person in his life, police, social workers, neighbors, had already decided she was gone for good. But Matt didn't believe them. And when he looked across that diner at a scarred, quiet biker named Cade Rourke and whispered 4 words, "I just need one ride," he triggered a chain of events that no one in that room could have predicted. What Cade found at the end of that crayon map nearly destroyed him. What it uncovered nearly destroyed an entire town. Stay with me until the very end of this story, because the final twist will leave you breathless. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. Ikek. The fog hadn't lifted all morning. It sat low across the flat expanse of Highway 9, like something pressed down by a hand that didn't want the world to see what lay beneath. The temperature had dropped overnight into the low 20s, and the kind of cold that crept in through every gap, through window seals, through boot leather, through skin, had settled across Harlan County like a debt nobody could pay. The Dusty Wheel Diner sat alone at the junction of Route 9 and a nameless farm road, a squat cinder-block building with a flat roof and a flickering neon sign that read, "Open," in letters the color of infected wounds. 2 of the letters had been dead for years. Nobody had fixed them. Nobody fixed much of anything around here anymore. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and the faint chemical sweetness of hand-rolled cigarettes smoked too close to the door. 6 motorcycles were parked in a loose row outside. Heavy machines, road-worn, their chrome dulled by salt and distance. Harleys, mostly. 1 Indian. All of them carrying the quiet authority of vehicles that had crossed state lines more times than their owners could count. The men who rode them sat in a loose cluster near the back of the diner. 5 of them at 2 pushed-together tables, one standing by the window with his arms crossed. They wore leather vests over thermal layers, the patches on their backs reading Iron Circle MC in a faded arc above a fractured compass rose. The cuts were old, worn soft, stained with road grit and engine oil and the invisible residue of lives that had gone sideways a long time ago. Nobody in the diner looked at them directly. The waitress, a thin woman in her 50s named Donna, who had worked this counter since before the highway bypass killed the town's commerce, refilled their mugs without being asked and didn't make small talk. She'd learned years ago that the Iron Circle tipped well and caused no trouble, and that was enough. Cade Rourke sat at the end of the table nearest the wall. He was 44 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray threaded through his dark hair made him look older. He had wide, scarred hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, and he stared into the coffee like he was reading something written at the bottom that no one else could see. He hadn't spoken in over 20 minutes. The other men had stopped trying to pull him into conversation. There was a weight to Cade that the other Iron Circle members understood without discussing. He'd come back from 2 tours overseas with shrapnel in his left shoulder and a silence that had never fully broken. His wife, Laura, had left 4 years ago. Not because he drank, not because he hit, but because living with a man who woke screaming 3 nights a week and then refused to talk about it was its own kind of violence. She'd taken their daughter, Mia, who had been 7 at the time. Cade saw Mia once a month now in a supervised visitation center that smelled like floor cleaner and institutional sadness, and every single visit felt like being punished for a crime he couldn't name. He didn't talk about any of it. The club knew. That was enough. The man standing at the window was Rooster, real name Dennis Barlow, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms. He was 6'3" and built like a piece of construction equipment that someone had forgotten to disassemble. A thick scar ran from his left ear down across his jaw, a souvenir from a bar fight in Tulsa 8 years ago that had ended with 2 men in the hospital and Rooster walking out under his own power. He watched the parking lot with the calm, constant vigilance of a man who had learned never to let his guard down completely. "Fog's getting worse," Rooster said to no one in particular. "Always does this time of year," said Jules, the youngest member at the table. 26, lean, wiry, with nervous hands that were always moving, spinning a lighter, tapping the table edge, pulling at the frayed cuff of his flannel. He'd been with the Iron Circle for 3 years. Before that, he'd been sleeping in his car behind a truck stop outside of Wichita, working day labor and trying to stay clean after an opioid habit that had eaten his early 20s alive. Nobody had asked Jules about his past when he'd first shown up. They'd watched him, tested him, and when he'd proven steady, they'd handed him a cut and a seat at the table. That was how the Iron Circle worked, not through interrogation, through observation. The door opened. The cold came in first, a blade of frozen air that cut across the warm interior and made every head turn. Then the boy. He was small. Too small for whatever age he actually was, like his body had decided to stop growing because it was too busy doing other things. Surviving, mostly. Dirty sneakers with the sole separating on the left foot, jeans too big, cinched with what looked like a length of clothesline, a coat that might have been blue once, now faded to the color of a bruise in its final stage. No hat. No gloves. His ears were red from the cold. His lips were cracked. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room the way a wild animal looks at a clearing, assessing threat, calculating escape routes, deciding whether the risk of coming closer was worth what might be gained. Donna started toward him. "Honey, you okay? Where's your—" The boy ignored her. His eyes moved across the diner, past the empty booths, past the counter stools, past the cook watching through the pass-through window, and locked onto the table of bikers. He walked toward them. Every man at the table noticed. Rooster unfolded his arms. Jules stopped spinning his lighter. A man named Preacher, Darrell Combs, the club's road captain, 51 years old with a salt and pepper beard and a voice like gravel rolling downhill, put down his fork and watched the kid approach with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and concern. The boy stopped 3 feet from the end of the table. He was looking at Cade. "You're Cade Rourke," the boy said. Not a question. A fact. Cade lifted his eyes from the coffee. The boy's face hit him somewhere behind the sternum. Not because of anything specific in the features, but because of the expression. He'd seen that expression before. In mirrors. In the faces of men coming off transport planes. It was the look of someone who had been abandoned by every system designed to protect them and had decided to solve the problem themselves. "Who's asking?" Cade said. "My name is Matt Mercer." The boy's voice was thin but steady, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this moment while walking through the cold. "I just need one ride." The table was quiet. Rooster took a half step forward. "Kid, where are your parents?" Preacher asked. Matt didn't look at Preacher. He kept his eyes locked on Cade, and from inside his coat, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. Construction paper, the kind used in elementary school art class. Yellow. It had been folded and refolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. He unfolded it on the table. It was a map, drawn in crayon. Roads in brown. Trees in green. A blue square at the end of a winding line that might have been a dirt road. Letters in a child's careful handwriting labeled landmarks. Gas station, bridge, big tree, blue house. "My mom drew this," Matt said, "before she disappeared. She hid it inside my pillowcase. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I should find someone who would listen." The silence in the diner was absolute. Even the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed to pause. "Your mom," Cade said slowly. "What happened to her?" "They said she left. Social services, the police, my foster family. Everyone says she abandoned me." Matt's voice cracked for the first time, a fracture running through the rehearsed steadiness. "But she didn't. She wouldn't. She drew me a map. People who leave don't draw maps." Cade stared at the yellow paper, the crayon lines, the careful, desperate handwriting. "How long has she been gone?" he asked. 6 weeks. Preacher leaned forward. 6 weeks? And the police? Closed the case. Matt's jaw tightened. They said there was no evidence of foul play. They said she had a history of instability. They put me with a foster family and told me to adjust. He said the last word like it was something rotting in his mouth. Jules exchanged a glance with Rooster. Both of them knew what it meant when a case got closed that fast. It meant someone had decided that the missing person wasn't worth the resources. It meant a box had been checked and a file had been shelved, and a human being had been reduced to a statistic that nobody wanted to count. "Why me?" Cade asked. Matt reached into his other pocket and pulled out a newspaper clipping, worn, creased, handled as many times as the map. He placed it on the table next to the crayon drawing. The headline was from the Harlan County Register, dated 18 months earlier. Local motorcycle club helps locate missing teen. "You found that girl," Matt said. "The one who ran away from the group home. Everyone else gave up. You didn't." Cade remembered. 16-year-old named Parker Byrne. She'd been in the foster system since she was 12, bounced between 4 homes, and disappeared from a group facility outside of Redfield. The police had classified her as a runaway and deprioritized the search. Cade and 3 other Iron Circle members had spent 11 days riding back roads and asking questions at gas stations until they'd found her in an abandoned rail depot 30 miles south, hypothermic and terrified but alive. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because the system had failed that girl the same way the system had failed him, quietly, efficiently, and with a clear conscience. Now this boy was standing in front of him with a crayon map and the same desperate faith that someone, somewhere, would actually give a damn. "Matt," Cade said carefully, "I'm not a cop. I'm not a detective. I'm a guy who fixes motorcycles and sleeps in a room above a garage." "I know," Matt said. "That's why I'm asking you instead of them." The words landed in the diner like a stone dropped into still water. Cade looked at the map again. At the blue square drawn in crayon at the end of the winding road. At the word Mama written beside it in letters so small he had to lean forward to read them. He looked up at Rooster. Rooster's face was unreadable, which in itself was a message. When Rooster showed nothing, it meant he was leaving the decision entirely in your hands. No pressure, no judgment, just the weight of it. Preacher was watching Cade with those deep-set eyes that always seemed to be running calculations 3 moves ahead. He gave the smallest nod. Not permission, acknowledgement. "Donna," Cade said without looking away from the boy, "get this kid a plate of eggs and some toast, and hot chocolate if you've got it." "I've got it," Donna said softly. She was already moving. "Sit down, Matt," Cade said. Matt sat, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something in his face loosened. Not a smile, not relief, just the faintest easing of attention that a 10-year-old should never have been carrying in the first place. While Matt ate, fast, hungrily, the way someone eats who doesn't know when the next meal is coming, Cade studied the map. The roads matched rural routes in the southern part of the county. He recognized some of the landmarks. The gas station was probably the abandoned Sinclair station on Route 14. The bridge could be the narrow crossing over Willow Creek. The big tree. There was a massive dead oak at the split where County Road 7 turned to gravel. The Blue House. That was the destination. "Preacher," Cade said quietly. "You know anything about a blue farmhouse south of the creek crossing on CR7? Preacher rubbed his jaw. "There's a bunch of old properties down that way. Foreclosures mostly. County took them back years ago. Some of them got bought up by that development company. What's it called? Meridian Holdings. They were supposed to build something. Never did." "Meridian Holdings," Cade repeated. The name sat wrong in his mouth, like biting down on a piece of grit in bread. "Big money outfit," Preacher continued. "Connected. The guy who runs it, something Caldwell, he plays golf with the county commissioner, donated to the sheriff's re-election campaign." Jules looked up from his phone. "Victor Caldwell, I just looked him up. Meridian Holdings, LLC. They own about 40 parcels in the southern part of the county, most of them sitting empty." "Convenient place to keep things nobody's supposed to find," Rooster said from the window. The implication settled over the table like a second layer of fog. Cade looked at Matt. The boy had stopped eating and was watching the adults with an expression that was far too old for his face. The expression of someone who understood exactly what was being said and was waiting to see if, this time, someone would actually act on it. "Matt," Cade said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Has anyone else seen this map?" Matt shook his head. "My mom told me to keep it hidden. She said—" He stopped, swallowed. "She said not everyone who smiles at you is safe." The words hung in the air like smoke. Cade folded the map carefully and slid it back across the table to the boy. "Keep that close. Don't show it to anyone else. Not police, not your foster family, not teachers. Nobody. Matt tucked it back inside his coat with the efficiency of someone who had been guarding something precious for a long time. We need to go to the police, Jules said. Right? If there's a missing person and evidence the case was mishandled. We go to the police and what happens? Rooster's voice was flat. The same department that closed the case in record time suddenly gets motivated? The same guys who play cards with Victor Caldwell's security team? Rooster's right, Preacher said. We walk into that station with a crayon map and a kid's story. They'll pat the boy on the head, call his foster family, and that map disappears into an evidence locker that nobody ever opens again. Cade was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands, at the scars across his knuckles, at the faded tattoo on his right forearm. A compass rose that matched the one on his vest, inked the week he'd joined the Iron Circle, 8 years ago, when he'd been a man with nothing left, and the club had given him a reason to keep riding. He thought about Mia, his daughter. 7 years old the last time she'd lived under his roof. She'd be 11 now, the same age as this boy sitting across from him with his hollow eyes and his crayon map and his refusal to believe what every adult in his life had told him. We ride south, Cade said. The table shifted. Not physically, something deeper. A current of agreement that moved through the men like voltage through a wire. Today? Jules asked. Right now. Cade stood up. Rooster, call Dutch and Loomis. Tell them to meet us at the gas station on 14. Preacher, you're running point on the map. Jules, you're on the kid. On the kid? Jules blinked. He rides with me, Cade said. But if anything goes wrong, you get him out first, before anything else, before me. You understand? Jules met his eyes. Whatever he saw there was enough. Yeah, he said. I understand. Cade pulled a 20 from his wallet and left it on the table for Donna. He looked down at Matt, who had already slid out of the booth and was standing with his hands at his sides, ready. You ever been on a motorcycle? Cade asked. No? You scared? Matt looked at him with those ancient, hollowed eyes. I've been scared for 6 weeks. A motorcycle isn't going to make it worse. They walked out into the cold. The fog had thickened. Visibility was maybe 100 yards, and the world beyond the diner parking lot existed as shapes and suggestions. The dark line of the tree line, the faint pulse of a distant cell tower light, the gray void of the sky pressing down like a ceiling made of lead. The Harleys started one by one. Each engine turning over was a declaration, not of aggression, but of intent. The sound was low, heavy, resonant, the kind of vibration you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. Cade handed Matt a helmet. It was too big for the boy. It was the only spare they had. Hold on to me, Cade said. Both hands. Don't let go for any reason. Matt climbed up behind him. His small hands gripped the sides of Cade's leather vest, and the weight of the boy against his back was so light, so impossibly light, that something cracked open inside Cade that he had spent years sealing shut. He thought about his daughter. He twisted the throttle. The Iron Circle rolled out of the parking lot in a loose formation. Preacher in front, Cade and Matt second, Rooster and Jules flanking, with Dutch and Loomis expected to join at the rendezvous point. The engines echoed off the flat landscape and were swallowed by the fog within seconds. They rode south on Route 14. The road was empty. No other vehicles. No houses. Just the gray pavement unspooling ahead and the fog pressing in from both sides like curtains closing on a stage. Matt's hands tightened on Cade's vest as the speed climbed, but the boy didn't make a sound. After 40 minutes, they reached the abandoned Sinclair station. 2 more bikes were already waiting. Dutch, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, stood beside his machine smoking a cigarette. Loomis, younger and quieter, sat on his Harley with his arms folded, watching the road they'd come from. "Who's the kid?" Dutch asked. "He's with me," Cade said. No further explanation. Dutch looked at Matt, looked at Cade, took a drag off his cigarette and dropped it on the cracked asphalt. "All right then." They continued south. The landmarks on Matt's map began to appear. The narrow bridge over Willow Creek, its metal railing rusted to the color of dried blood. The dead oak at the split of County Road 7, its bare branches reaching into the fog like the fingers of something buried that was trying to claw its way out. The gravel road. Preacher slowed. The bikes fell into single file. The gravel crunched under the tires with a sound that was too loud in the silence, a sound that felt like an announcement to whoever or whatever was waiting at the end of this road. They rode for another mile. 2 miles. The fog was impenetrable now. Trees pressed close on both sides, leafless and skeletal. An old fence line ran parallel to the road, its posts leaning at angles that suggested the ground itself had shifted underneath them. And then, through the fog, a shape. Blue. A farmhouse, 2 stories. The paint was peeling, the porch was sagging, and the windows on the second floor were dark. But the first floor windows had curtains, and on the porch, barely visible in the gray light, sat a pair of muddy boots. Someone had been here. Recently. Cade stopped his bike. The other engines cut one by one. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were the ticking of cooling metal and the faint creak of the farmhouse's porch in the wind. Matt was trembling. Not from the cold. "That's it," the boy whispered. "That's the blue house." Cade looked at the building, at the boots on the porch, at the curtains in the windows. His instincts, the ones forged in places where wrong decisions got people killed, were screaming 2 things simultaneously. Someone is here and this is wrong. He swung off the bike and helped Matt down. Rooster was already moving toward the property's left flank, his movements precise. Economy of motion that belonged to a man trained for worse situations than this. Preacher approached the front. Dutch and Loomis held the road. "Stay with Jules," Cade told Matt. "But, stay with Jules." Cade's voice left no room. He turned and walked toward the porch. The front door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, slightly ajar. The hinges groaned when Cade pushed it open, and the smell that came out was stale air and dust and something underneath both. Something organic, something lived in. The interior was sparse, a table with 1 chair, a mattress on the floor with a single blanket, a coffee mug with dried residue at the bottom, a camping lantern, canned food, 3 empty cans in a trash bag by the door, labels removed. Someone had been staying here. Not comfortably. Not voluntarily, from the look of it. Cade moved through the house. Upstairs was empty. A bathroom with a working faucet, but no hot water. A bedroom with nothing in it but dust and a broken window that let in a thin whistle of frozen air. He came back down. Rooster was standing in the kitchen, holding something. "Found this behind the stove," Rooster said. It was a hair tie, purple, the kind with a small plastic flower attached. Cade took it, turned it in his fingers. His jaw was tight. "Could be anyone's," Preacher said from the doorway. But his voice didn't carry conviction. "Let's check outside," Cade said. They searched the property. Behind the house, the land sloped down toward a tree line. An old storage shed sat 50 yards from the back door, its padlock broken and hanging. Inside the shed, garden tools, a rusted lawnmower, and nothing else. But next to the shed, the ground had been disturbed. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. A rectangular patch of earth, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, where the dead grass had been torn away and the soil was darker than the surrounding ground. Recently turned. Rooster saw it first. He stopped walking and stared at the patch of disturbed earth with an expression that made the temperature feel like it had dropped another 10 degrees. "Cade," he said quietly. Cade saw it, his stomach twisted. "Preacher, get the shovel from the shed." Nobody spoke while they dug. The soil was soft. Too soft for ground that should have been frozen solid. Someone had turned this earth within the last few days. The shovel hit something after less than 2 feet. Plastic. Black garbage bag. Cade knelt down and pulled the bag free with his bare hands. The plastic was cold and slick with moisture. He set it on the ground beside the hole and looked up at Rooster, who nodded once. He opened it. A jacket, women's size, denim with a fleece collar. Stuffed underneath it, a phone. Screen cracked, battery dead. And beneath the phone, a stack of papers. What looked like medical records, utility bills, and a single photograph. The photograph showed a woman, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, tired eyes. She was sitting on a porch step with a small boy in her lap, both of them squinting into the sun. On the back, in handwritten ink, Matt and Mama, August. Cade held the photograph. His hand was shaking, the jacket, the phone, the records. They weren't trash, they were evidence. Evidence that someone had gathered, buried, and hidden. Evidence that Vanessa Mercer hadn't walked away from her son. Evidence that she had been here, in this house, and then she had been somewhere else, and someone had tried very hard to erase the proof. Behind him, a small voice said, "Is that my mom's jacket?" Cade turned. Matt was standing 10 feet away. Jules was behind him, one hand on the boy's shoulder, his face pale. "I told him to stay by the bikes," Jules said helplessly. Matt stepped forward. His eyes were locked on the denim jacket in Cade's hands. He reached out and touched the fleece collar with his fingertips. "She wore this every day," Matt whispered. "Every single day." And then the boy broke. Not the way adults break, with attempts at composure, with hands over faces, with the performance of grief filtered through self-consciousness. Matt broke the way only a child can, completely, without defense, without shame. He collapsed forward and pressed his face into the jacket, and the sound that came out of him was not crying. It was something more primal than crying. It was the sound of 6 weeks of terror and loneliness and suppressed hope cracking open all at once. Cade knelt in the cold dirt beside that opened hole and pulled the boy against his chest. He held him. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He didn't make promises. He just held on. Over Matt's shaking shoulders, Cade met Rooster's eyes. The big man's expression had changed. The calm assessment was gone. In its place was something harder, something that looked like a decision being made. Preacher was already on his phone. "I know a detective," he said quietly. "County adjacent. Not connected to the local department. Name's Ethan Graves. He's been trying to reopen cold cases in this district for 2 years and getting stonewalled. If there's anyone who'll touch this without burying it again, it's him." "Call him," Cade said. The fog pressed in around the farmhouse. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of frozen earth and dead leaves, and something else. Something Cade couldn't name but recognized the way you recognize a sound you've heard before in a dream. It was the smell of a story that was about to get much, much worse before it got better. Because the jacket and the phone and the buried evidence answered one question. Vanessa Mercer had not abandoned her son. But they raised another question, a worse one. If she didn't leave willingly, then where was she now? And the phone, when they finally charged it, when they finally pulled the call records and the text messages and the data that someone had tried to destroy, whose name would they find? Cade looked down at the boy in his arms, at the crayon map that had led them here, at the jacket that proved a mother's love and a mother's fear in equal measure. Somewhere out there, beyond the fog and the gravel roads and the empty farmland, someone powerful was about to discover that their secret hadn't stayed buried. And 40 miles north, in a glass-walled office overlooking downtown, Victor Caldwell's phone buzzed with a message from a contact he kept off the books. "Someone's been to the farmhouse." Caldwell read the message twice. Then he picked up a different phone, the one with no registered number, and dialed. "Clean it," he said, "all of it, tonight." He hung up. Outside his window, the fog was rolling in. The call to Ethan Graves went to voicemail 3 times before the detective picked up on the 4th. His voice was rough, the kind of rough that comes from being woken out of the first real sleep someone has managed in days. There was a pause after Preacher identified himself. Not the pause of confusion, but of calculation. Graves knew who the Iron Circle was. Everybody in a 3-county radius knew. And the fact that he didn't hang up immediately told Preacher everything he needed to know about where the detective stood with his own department. "I'm listening," Graves said. Preacher walked him through it in under 2 minutes. Missing woman, closed case, a child's map, a buried bag of evidence at an abandoned farmhouse tied to Meridian Holdings. He kept his voice low, standing 20 feet from the group, his back to the wind. When he finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "Which farmhouse?" Graves asked. Preacher gave him the location. Another silence. Then Graves said something that made Preacher's hand tighten around the phone. "That property's been flagged in 2 other complaints I've tried to file. Both got kicked back. My lieutenant said there was insufficient basis to investigate. And now? Now I'm putting on my boots." A rustling sound, a drawer opening. Don't touch anything else at that site. I mean it. You've already compromised the burial location, but everything inside the house needs to stay exactly where it is. I'll be there in 90 minutes. We'll be here, Preacher said. He hung up and walked back to the group. Cade was still kneeling in the dirt beside the opened hole, Matt pressed against his chest. The boy had stopped making sounds, but his body still shook in small, irregular tremors, like aftershocks from an earthquake that had already passed. Graves is coming, Preacher said. Hour and a half. Can we trust him? Rooster asked. He's been trying to investigate properties connected to Meridian for 2 years and getting shut down by his own chain of command. Either he's the most committed liar in county law enforcement, or he's the one honest cop left. That's not an answer, Rooster said. It's the only one I've got. Cade stood up slowly. Matt stayed close, his hand gripping the hem of Cade's leather vest like a tether. The boy's face was swollen and raw from crying, but his eyes were dry now, and there was something behind them that hadn't been there an hour ago. Not hope, exactly, but its dangerous cousin, certainty. We wait, Cade said. Nobody leaves. Nobody touches the house. And nobody, he looked at each man in turn. Nobody calls anyone about this. Not family, not friends, not other chapters. Until we know who we're dealing with, this stays between us and Graves. Dutch shifted his weight. And if Caldwell's people are already on their way, you heard what Preacher said. The man's connected. He's got eyes everywhere. Then we'll see them coming. Cade's voice was flat, final. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was no longer interested in debating it. They waited. The fog sat on the property like a living thing, thick and wet and cold. Rooster positioned himself at the end of the gravel road with a clear sight line in both directions. Dutch and Loomis moved their bikes behind the shed, out of view from the road. Jules stayed with Matt on the farmhouse porch, the boy sitting on the top step with his mother's jacket draped across his lap, his fingers tracing the fleece collar over and over in a repetitive motion that Jules recognized because he'd done the same thing in rehab. The compulsive touching of something real to keep yourself anchored when your mind wanted to float away. Cade stood alone by the burial site. He'd put the phone and the medical records back in the bag and set it beside the hole, untouched, the way Graves had instructed. But he kept the photograph. He stood in the cold with it in his hand, looking at the image of Vanessa and Matt on the porch step, squinting into sunlight that felt like it belonged to a different planet. Preacher approached him from behind. You okay? No. That's the right answer. Preacher lit a cigarette and cupped the flame against the wind. The smoke curled upward and was immediately shredded by the cold air. Listen, Cade, I need to say something, and you're not going to like it. Cade didn't respond. He waited. This kid found you because of the Parker Byrne thing, the runaway girl we brought home 18 months ago. That worked out. It did. But this isn't the same situation. Preacher's voice was careful, measured, the way a man speaks when he knows the words might detonate something. A runaway teenager hiding in an abandoned building is one thing. A woman who was forcibly disappeared by someone with political connections and enough resources to bury evidence, that's another thing entirely. That's not a rescue. That's a war. I know what it is. Do you? Preacher took a drag. Because the last time you decided to carry someone else's fight, it cost you your marriage. It cost you custody of your daughter. Laura didn't leave because you were broken, Cade. She left because you keep breaking yourself on other people's problems, and there's never anything left for the people standing right in front of you. The words hit like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were precise. Cade's jaw worked. The muscles in his neck went rigid. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind and the distant tick of cooling motorcycle engines. You think I don't know that, Cade said quietly. I think you know it, and you're about to do it again anyway. And what's the alternative? We hand that boy back to his foster family and drive away? We pretend we didn't find his mother's jacket buried in the dirt behind a house owned by a man who paid to make her disappear? The alternative is we hand the evidence to Graves and let the system work. Cade turned and looked at Preacher, really looked at him. The system put a 10-year-old in foster care and closed his mother's case in less than 2 weeks. The system is the reason that boy had to walk through the cold to a diner full of strangers and beg for help. Don't tell me to trust the system, Daryl. Not today. The use of Preacher's real name was deliberate. It stripped away the club identity and put the conversation on personal ground. Two men who had known each other for nearly a decade, who had buried friends and ridden through storms and sat in hospital waiting rooms together, now standing on opposite sides of a line that was being drawn in real time. Preacher held his gaze. Then he dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. I'm not saying walk away. I'm saying be honest about what this is going to cost. Because it's going to cost something, brother. It always does. He turned and walked back toward the house. Cade stood there in the cold, alone with the photograph and the weight of everything Preacher had just said, and he hated the man for being right and hated himself for not caring. Ethan Graves arrived in an unmarked Chevy Tahoe exactly 87 minutes after the call. He was younger than Cade had expected, mid-30s with a lean face and a 3-day beard and the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes permanently, like a stain that won't wash out. He wore jeans, boots, and a lined canvas jacket, no badge visible, no gun visible either, though Cade would have bet his life there was one on his hip. Graves parked at the edge of the property and walked the gravel on foot. He stopped when he saw the motorcycles, counted them, then continued toward the group assembled near the back of the house. "Which one of you is Preacher?" he asked. "That's me?" Graves looked at each biker in turn. His eyes moved the way a detective's eyes move, cataloging, filing, building a picture from details that most people would miss. He paused when he saw Matt sitting on the porch with the jacket. "That the boy?" "Matt Mercer," Cade said. Graves nodded slowly. He walked to the burial site without being directed and crouched beside the opened hole. He looked at the disturbed earth, the bag, the position of the items inside. His expression didn't change, but his breathing did. One long, controlled exhale through his nose, the way someone breathes when they're trying to keep their composure in front of other people. "You handled this?" he asked. "I dug it up," Cade said. "I opened the bag. I touched the jacket, the phone, the photograph, and the papers. Nothing else." "The house?" "We walked through it. Didn't move anything." Graves stood up and pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from his jacket pocket. He put them on with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and knelt beside the bag again, this time lifting each item with careful, deliberate motions. He spent a long time on the phone, turned it over, checked the SIM card slot, examined the cracked screen. "This is a prepaid phone," he said. "Not her personal device. Someone gave this to her or she bought it to keep communication off the grid." "Can you pull anything from it?" Jules asked. "Not here. I need to charge it first and run the data in a controlled environment. If there are call records or text logs, they'll tell us who she was communicating with. And more importantly, who was communicating with her." He moved to the medical records, leafed through them carefully, stopped on one page. His jaw tightened. "These are psychiatric evaluation forms," he said, "signed by a Dr. Warren Kessler, County Mental Health Services." He looked up at the group. "Vanessa Mercer was involuntarily evaluated 3 weeks before she disappeared. The form states she was exhibiting paranoid ideation and delusional behavior. Recommended for outpatient monitoring. The conclusion says she posed no danger to herself or others, but..." He held up the page. "This diagnosis is what they used to discredit her. When she went missing, the police used this evaluation to classify her as an unstable individual who likely left voluntarily." "Was she actually unstable?" Rooster asked. Graves set the papers down carefully. "I've seen Warren Kessler's name on 4 other evaluations connected to Meridian Holdings property disputes. Every single one of them diagnosed someone as unstable right before they became inconvenient. Draw your own conclusions." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was the silence of understanding, the moment when the shape of something ugly becomes fully visible and you realize it's much larger than you thought. "She wasn't crazy," Matt said from the porch. Every head turned. The boy was standing now, his mother's jacket clutched against his chest, his eyes fixed on Graves with an intensity that made the detective look away first. "She told me people were following her. She told me someone wanted our house. She told me things were going to happen, and I needed to be ready." Matt's voice was shaking, but his words were clear. "Everyone said she was making it up. My teacher, my foster mom, the lady from social services. They all said the same thing, that my mom had problems and she needed help, and sometimes people who need help go away for a while. He took a step forward. But she hid a map in my pillowcase. She buried a bag with evidence behind a house. She kept a secret phone. Do crazy people do that? Do people having delusions make plans? Nobody answered. She knew something was coming, Matt said, and nobody listened to her, and now she's gone. Graves knelt in front of the boy, not in the practiced way of a detective interviewing a minor, but in the way of a man who had just been confronted with something that made his professional composure feel inadequate. Matt, he said, I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen to every single thing you can tell me about your mother, about what she said, about what she did in the weeks before she disappeared, and I'm going to treat every word of it as credible information. Can you do that? Can you tell me everything? Matt looked at Cade. Cade nodded. Yeah, Matt said. I can do that. They sat on the porch, Graves, Matt, and Cade, while the detective recorded the conversation on his phone. Matt talked for 45 minutes. He talked about his mother coming home from work at the convenience store and checking the locks 3 times, about the car that parked across the street at night with its lights off, about the man in a gray suit who came to the door and told Vanessa that the county had approved a development plan for their street and that she should consider the relocation offer, about Vanessa telling the man she wasn't moving, about the look on the man's face when she said it. He talked about the night Vanessa woke him up at 2 a.m. and made him memorize a phone number, about the afternoon she came home with the Crayon map and told him where to hide it, about her voice when she said, "If I'm not here someday, you find somebody who will help. Not police, not the state. Someone real." Someone real. The word sat in Cade's chest like a coal. Graves asked precise, careful questions, times, dates, physical descriptions, the color of the car, the man's face, any names Vanessa had mentioned. Matt answered everyone. His memory was extraordinary, the kind of detailed, hyper-vivid recall that comes from living in a state of constant alertness, where every detail might be the difference between safety and danger. When it was over, Graves turned off the recording and sat quietly for a long moment. "This is enough to reopen the investigation," he said. "The physical evidence, the connection to Meridian properties, the psychiatric evaluation pattern, and the witness testimony. But I need to be honest with you about what happens next." "Go ahead," Cade said. "I file to reopen. My lieutenant sees the filing. The lieutenant reports to a captain who has lunch with the county commissioner every other Thursday. The county commissioner is Victor Caldwell's golfing partner. Within 24 hours of me filing, Caldwell knows we were here, knows what we found, and knows exactly how much danger he's in. So what do? I go above their heads. I take this to the State Bureau. It's slower, but it bypasses the local chain of command entirely. Problem is, once I do that, I'm a target too. My career. Maybe more." Rooster, who had been listening from 10 feet away, spoke up. "Why would you do that for strangers?" Graves looked at him. "Because I've been watching cases disappear from my desk for 2 years. Because I became a cop to do something, and all I've done is file paperwork for people who don't want the work done. Because..." He stopped, swallowed. "Because I had a little brother who needed someone to listen, and nobody did, and he's not here anymore." He said it simply, without drama. The way people state facts that have become so deeply embedded in their lives that the emotion has been compressed into something hard and permanent, like a fossil. Nobody asked for details. Nobody needed to. "I'll file with the State Bureau by Monday," Graves said. "In the meantime, this site needs to be preserved. I'm going to call in a favor with a forensic tech I trust to process the house and the burial site properly. Evidence chain has to be clean or none of this holds up." "And the boy?" Cade asked. Graves looked at Matt, who was sitting on the porch step again, his eyes unfocused, the jacket still in his lap. "Technically, he needs to go back to his foster placement." "No." Cade's voice was immediate, hard. "I said technically. I'm not going to call his foster family tonight, but you need to understand, if you keep him and this goes to court, that's a problem. You don't have legal custody. You don't have authority. A defense attorney will use that to question your credibility and his. I don't care. You should care, because if you want to bring Vanessa home, everything has to be above reproach. Everything." Graves stood up and brushed the dirt off his knees. I'll talk to a family court contact, see if we can get an emergency temporary guardianship order. It'll take a few days. Until then, he looked at Cade with an expression that was part warning and part understanding. Keep him safe. Keep him quiet. And for the sake of everything, keep him away from anyone connected to county services. Cade nodded. Graves left. His Tahoe disappeared down the gravel road, and the sound of his engine faded into the fog until there was nothing left but the wind and the trees and the emptiness. The iron circle regrouped at the bikes. The temperature was still dropping. The fog was thick as wool. Nobody was comfortable. Nobody was warm. And nobody was talking about leaving, except Dutch. I need to say something, Dutch said. He was standing beside his Harley, his big hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, his red beard wet with condensation from the fog. He didn't look angry. He looked worried, which on Dutch was worse. This morning we came out for coffee. Now we're in the middle of a missing person investigation involving a real estate developer with political connections, a compromised police department, and a kid with no legal guardian. He looked at Cade. I'm not walking away from the boy, but I need to know what the play is because right now we're making moves without a plan, and that's how people get hurt. He's right, Loomis said quietly. It was the first time Loomis had spoken all day. He was a man of so few words that when he used them, people listened. We're exposed. We've been at this location for hours. If Caldwell has surveillance on his properties, cameras, motion sensors, anything, he already knows we're here. Cade thought about the text message he'd imagined earlier, the one that would reach Caldwell's phone. Someone's been to the farmhouse. Was it already too late? Had the message already been sent? Was someone already driving toward this property with instructions to make the evidence disappear? We need the bag, Cade said. The evidence. The phone especially. Graves said not to touch anything, Preacher reminded him. Graves is filing paperwork on Monday. It's Saturday. If Caldwell sends people here tonight, there won't be anything left to file about. The conflict played out in the looks exchanged between the men. Preacher's jaw was set. He was the voice of caution, always had been, and every instinct in his body was telling him that moving the evidence was a mistake. Rooster's eyes were on Cade, reading him, calculating whether this was strategy or emotion driving the decision. Jules was watching Matt. Dutch was watching the road. We photograph everything, Cade said. Every item, every position, every angle. Then we take the bag and we secure it somewhere that isn't here. Graves gets the photos and the location of the secured evidence. The chain doesn't break. It just moves. And if a judge throws it out because a bunch of bikers handled the evidence instead of law enforcement, Preacher said, then a judge throws it out. But at least the evidence still exists. Preacher stared at him for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and started taking photographs. They documented everything. The burial site from 4 angles, the bag's position. Each item laid out on the ground with a gloved hand holding a scale reference. The interior of the house, the mattress, the canned food, the coffee mug, the camping lantern, the boots on the porch, the hair tie from behind the stove. Jules photographed the crayon map at Cade's request. Matt held it flat while Jules shot it from directly above, capturing every line, every label, every crayon stroke. Then they packed the evidence bag into a saddlebag on Rooster's bike, the most secure of the group, fitted with a locking hard case, and they rode. The convoy moved north in tight formation. The fog was blinding now. Headlights carved tunnels of light that collapsed within 30 feet. They rode at half speed, engines growling in low gear, the sound swallowed by the white void around them. Matt rode behind Cade again. The boy's hands were tight on the leather vest, and his face was pressed against Cade's back. He hadn't spoken since Graves left. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything a 10-year-old brain was trying to process and couldn't. They reached the Iron Circle clubhouse just after 5 in the afternoon. The clubhouse was a converted auto repair shop on the edge of a town called Redfield, a town that had been dying slowly for 20 years and was now mostly empty storefronts and cracked sidewalks, and the kind of resigned quiet that settles over places that have been forgotten by everyone who had the means to leave. The shop still functioned. The front bay was Cade's workspace. Lifts, tool chests, parts bins, the controlled chaos of a man who made his living keeping machines alive. The back half had been converted over the years into a meeting space. A long table made from a reclaimed barn door, mismatched chairs, a kitchenette with a coffee maker that was always running, and a wood stove that Rooster kept burning from October through April. Upstairs, above the shop, were two small rooms. One was Cade's. A bed, a dresser, a nightstand with a framed photograph of Mia that he looked at every night before he turned off the light. The other room was storage, boxes of old parts, spare bedding, a folding cot. Cade set up the cot in the storage room for Matt, found clean blankets, cleared a space, put a glass of water on an overturned crate beside the bed. Matt stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the cot, at the blankets. His face did something complicated, gratitude and grief and exhaustion moving across his features in quick succession, none of them settling. "It's not much," Cade said. "It's more than the Foster house," Matt said. He walked to the cot and sat down. The springs creaked under his minimal weight. He was still holding his mother's jacket. "Try to sleep," Cade said. "I don't sleep much." "I know the feeling." Cade left the door open a crack and went downstairs. The club was gathered around the long table. Coffee was poured. The wood stove crackled. The room smelled like burning oak and old motor oil and the particular musk of leather that has been worn through rain and wind and years. Preacher had the evidence bag on the table. Rooster was examining the phone. Jules was scrolling through photos on his camera, reviewing the documentation from the farmhouse. "We need to charge this phone," Rooster said. "It's a burner, cheap Android, micro USB. Shouldn't be hard to find a cable." Jules dug through a drawer and produced one. Rooster connected the phone to a power strip behind the coffee maker. The screen flickered. A white charging icon appeared. "Give it 20 minutes, Rooster said. In those 20 minutes, Cade made a decision he'd been avoiding for hours. He stepped outside into the cold. The parking lot behind the shop was gravel and patched concrete, hemmed in by a chain-link fence with privacy slats that rattled in the wind. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang 4 times, Laura answered. "Cade?" Her voice was neutral, the carefully maintained neutrality of a woman who had spent years learning how to interact with her ex-husband without reopening wounds. "It's Saturday. Visitation isn't until next week." "I know. I'm not calling about visitation." A pause. "Then what?" He told her. Not everything. Not the evidence, not Caldwell, not the buried bag. Just the basics. A boy who needed help, a missing mother, the iron circle involved. The silence on the other end was long enough that Cade checked to make sure the call was still connected. "You're doing it again," Laura said. "Laura, you're doing the exact same thing. Someone else's crisis, someone else's child, and you're diving in head first without thinking about what happens after. This is different." "It's never different, Cade. That's the problem. It's always different and it's always the same. You find someone who needs saving and you throw yourself at it, and everyone around you pays the price." Her voice cracked, not with anger, with something more exhausting than anger, the weariness of a pattern she'd watched repeat too many times. "What about Mia? What happens to your visitation if you end up in legal trouble over this?" "I'm not going to—" "You don't know that. You can't promise that. You could never promise that." A sharp breath. "I didn't call a lawyer because I stopped loving you. I called a lawyer because I couldn't keep watching you disappear into other people's pain and leave nothing for us." Cade pressed his forehead against the cold metal of the fence, closed his eyes. The wind cut through his jacket and he let it. "He's 10 years old, Laura. His mother was kidnapped by a man with enough money to buy the county, and every single adult in his life told him to sit down and accept it. He walked through the freezing cold with a crayon map because he couldn't find one person willing to help." Silence. "I'll never be the guy who turns away from that. I know it costs me. I know what it cost us. But if I become someone who can walk away from a kid holding a crayon map, then the man you married never existed in the first place." Laura didn't respond for a long time. When she did, her voice was quieter. "Don't get him killed, Cade. Don't get yourself killed. And call your daughter. She asked about you yesterday." She hung up. Cade stood in the cold for another minute. Then he went back inside. The phone was at 14%. Rooster had it unlocked. No passcode, which confirmed it was a disposable device. He was scrolling through the call history with Jules looking over his shoulder. 3 numbers, Rooster said as Cade approached. The phone was active for 11 days before Vanessa disappeared. Outgoing calls to 1 number. Made 6 times. Incoming calls from 2 different numbers. One of the incoming numbers called 14 times in 3 days. Can you identify them? Cade asked. The outgoing number she was calling is registered to a women's crisis center in Ashburn. She was reaching out for help. And the incoming? Rooster set the phone down on the table and turned it so everyone could see the screen. Jules had already run a reverse lookup on the second incoming number. The name on the screen was Warren Kessler, the psychiatrist, the one who had signed the evaluation declaring Vanessa unstable, the one whose name appeared on 4 other evaluations connected to Meridian Holdings disputes. He had called Vanessa's secret phone 14 times in 72 hours. Why would the doctor who signed off on her instability be calling her burner phone? Jules asked. Nobody answered. Because the answer was obvious, and it was ugly, and it changed everything. Kessler wasn't just a tool of the system. He was in the system. Involved. Active. 14 calls in 3 days meant urgency, meant monitoring, meant the line between evaluator and handler had been crossed so completely that there was no line left at all. Cade picked up the phone and scrolled to the text messages. There were only 4, all from Kessler's number, all sent in the final 48 hours before Vanessa vanished. The first read, "Stop talking to people. This can still be resolved." The second, "You don't understand what you're risking. Think about your son." The third, "Last chance. Take the offer, sign the papers, walk away clean." The fourth, sent at 11:47 p.m. the night before Vanessa disappeared. "You were warned." The room went silent. Jules sat down slowly. Dutch ran a hand over his face. Preacher stared at the phone with the expression of a man watching the last exit on a highway disappear behind him. Rooster looked at Cade. "We send this to Graves. It blows the case wide open. It also puts a target on Graves. On us. On the boy." "The target's already there, brother. Caldwell's people know we were at the farmhouse. The clock started the moment we dug up that bag." Cade looked toward the stairs, toward the room where Matt Mercer was lying on a cot with his mother's jacket, trying to sleep in a building full of strangers because every institution in his world had failed him. He looked back at the phone, at the last message. "You were warned. Vanessa had been warned. She hadn't backed down. And they had taken her. Now her son had led 7 bikers to the proof. And somewhere in a glass-walled office, Victor Caldwell was already moving pieces on a board that only he could see." Cade picked up the phone and photographed every message, every call record, every stored number. Then he dialed Graves. The detective answered on the first ring this time. He was awake. He was waiting. "We charged the phone," Cade said. "You need to hear what's on it." "Tell me." Cade read him the texts, the call logs, Kessler's name. The silence on Graves's end lasted 5 full seconds. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The weariness was gone. What replaced it was something colder, something that sounded like a man who had just been handed the key to a door he'd been pushing against for years. "Don't let that phone out of your sight," Graves said. "I'm driving to the state capitol tonight. The bureau chief owes me a conversation. By morning, this won't be a county case anymore. And if morning's too late, then we're all in a lot of trouble." A pause. "Cade, is the boy safe?" "He's with me." "Keep it that way. I'll call you before dawn." The line went dead. Cade set the phone on the table. He looked at the men around him. Preacher, Rooster, Dutch, Loomis, Jules. 5 men who had walked into a diner that morning expecting nothing more than bad coffee and quiet company. 5 men who were now standing at the edge of something that could not be walked back. "Last chance to step out," Cade said. "Nobody will think less of you." Nobody moved. "All right then," Cade said. Somewhere upstairs in the dark, Matt Mercer lay on a folding cot wrapped in a stranger's blanket, pressing his mother's jacket against his face. Breathing in the last trace of a scent he was terrified of forgetting. And 60 miles south, on a road that didn't appear on any public map, a black SUV with no plates pulled up to the blue farmhouse. Two men got out. One carried a gasoline can, the other carried a lighter. By midnight, the farmhouse was gone. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. Cade was sitting in the dark at the long table downstairs, his hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't slept. The wood stove had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the shop floor that made the shadows of the tool chests and engine lifts look like crouching figures. Upstairs, Matt was finally quiet. The boy had woken twice from nightmares, both times crying out a single word that Cade could hear through the floorboards. Mama. His phone lit up. Graves. Cade answered before the first ring finished. It's gone, Graves said. What's gone? The farmhouse. All of it. I drove past on my way to the Capitol. There's nothing left but a foundation and ash. They burned it, Cade. Sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. The fire department responded, but by the time they arrived, the structure was fully involved. Accelerant detected on scene. Official report will call it an electrical fault in an abandoned property. Cade's hand tightened around the phone. The mug in front of him blurred. His vision tunneled the way it used to tunnel in combat. Everything shrinking to a single point, all peripheral information dropping away until only the immediate threat remained. The burial site, he said. Excavated. Whoever came in after us dug up the surrounding area in a 10-foot radius. If there was anything else in that ground, it's gone. The shed was torn apart. The property is clean. Graves paused. They were thorough, Cade. This wasn't two guys with a gas can. This was a professional cleanup. Cade thought about the evidence bag locked in Rooster's saddlebag hard case, now sitting in the back of the shop under a tarp. He thought about the phone with its 4 text messages and its call logs, and Warren Kessler's number burned into the screen like a brand. The evidence we pulled is all that's left, Cade said. I know, which means you're holding the only physical proof that Vanessa Mercer was at that property, and that means whoever did this knows it's gone, and they're going to be looking for wherever it went. Where are you? 40 minutes from the Capitol. I have a meeting with the State Bureau's deputy director at 7, a woman named Catherine Holt. She's clean, career investigator, no political ties to Harlan County. If I can get her to open a state-level case, we bypass everything. Local PD, the county commissioner, all of it. And if she says no? Graves didn't answer right away. Then we're on our own with a bag of evidence and a target on every back. The line went dead. Cade sat in the dark and listened to the building settle around him. The creak of old wood, the distant tick of the clock on the wall, the faint rhythmic breathing of a child sleeping above his head. He stood up and walked to the back of the shop where Rooster's hard case sat under the tarp. He unlocked it, pulled out the evidence bag, held it in his hands. The weight of it was nothing. A jacket, a dead phone, some papers, a photograph. Less than 5 pounds. And yet it was the heaviest thing he had ever carried, because inside this bag was a woman's life. The proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she hadn't walked away from her son. And if this bag disappeared, there would be nothing left. Vanessa Mercer would become a closed file and a fading memory, and a boy who grew up believing a lie. He put the bag back, locked the case, covered it with the tarp. Then he made coffee and waited for the others to wake up. Rooster was the first one down at 6. He came through the door from the side entrance where he'd been sleeping in his truck, a habit from years of never being fully comfortable indoors, and his eyes went straight to Cade's face. How bad? Rooster asked. They burned the farmhouse. Rooster stopped walking. His hand, which had been reaching for a coffee mug, hung in the air for a moment. Then he completed the motion, poured the coffee, and sat down across from Cade with the deliberate calm of a man who had received bad news too many times to let it change his posture. Professional job? Graves thinks so. Then they'll come here next. It wasn't a question, Cade nodded. We need to move the evidence, Rooster said. Somewhere off-site, somewhere that isn't connected to any Iron Circle property or any member's name. Where? Rooster thought about it. He took a long drink of coffee, his scarred hands dwarfing the mug. I know a place. Storage unit outside of Ashburn, registered under a name that hasn't been active in 3 years. A dead man's rental, paid through the end of next year. Whose? My brother's. Cade looked at him. In 8 years of writing together, Rooster had never once mentioned a brother. Not at the table, not on the road, not during the long nights when men told stories to keep themselves awake. He died in 2021, Rooster said. Overdose. Fentanyl. He was 31. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, controlled, the emotion sealed behind a wall so thick you could feel its presence but never see through it. The storage unit was his. I've been paying the rent because there's nothing in it I can bring myself to deal with and nothing I can bring myself to throw away. But there's room. I'm sorry, Cade said. Don't be. I'll get the key. Rooster stood up and walked outside without another word. By 7, the club was assembled. Preacher arrived on his bike, his leather collar turned up against a freezing drizzle that had replaced the fog overnight. Jules came in through the front bay, smelling like wet pavement and cigarettes. Dutch and Loomis pulled up together, their engines rumbling in unison before cutting to silence in the gravel lot. Cade briefed them. The farmhouse. The fire. Graves's meeting at the Capitol. The need to relocate the evidence. He delivered the information in clipped, emotionless sentences, the way a field commander delivers a situation report. Facts only, analysis implied, panic reserved for people who had the luxury of time. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the hiss of rain on the metal roof and the tick of the wood stove as Loomis fed it fresh logs. They're ahead of us, Dutch said. His voice was heavy. Not with fear. Dutch didn't operate on fear, but with the weight of tactical disadvantage. They knew about the farmhouse visit within hours. They had a cleanup crew deployed by midnight. That means they have eyes on their properties. They have manpower on call, and they have the operational discipline to execute a total evidence wipe in less than 8 hours. We're not equipped for this, Loomis said. 6 words. Each one landed like a hammer strike on a nail. We're not supposed to be equipped for this, Preacher said. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his face drawn and tired. We're a motorcycle club. We fix bikes, we ride roads, we look out for people the system forgot. We're not investigators. We're not soldiers. Some of us were, Rooster said from the doorway. Preacher looked at him. That was a different war. War doesn't change, only the terrain. The tension between them was palpable. Not hostility, but the grinding friction of 2 men who saw the same situation through fundamentally different lenses. Preacher saw risk, consequence, the long game. Rooster saw threat, response, the immediate moment. Both were right. Both knew it, and neither was willing to yield. Matt can't hear this, Cade said quietly. He looked toward the stairs. Jules, go check on him. If he's awake, take him to the kitchenette. Get him breakfast. Keep him away from this conversation. Jules went upstairs. A minute later, soft footsteps on the floor above. 2 sets, one heavy, one impossibly light. Here's what we know, Cade said when they were gone. Vanessa Mercer was living in a property owned by Meridian Holdings. She was being monitored by a psychiatrist named Warren Kessler, who appears to be working directly with or for Victor Caldwell. She was threatened via text message. She refused to cooperate. She disappeared. The official record says she left voluntarily. The physical evidence says otherwise. And now the physical evidence is all we've got, Dutch said. Graves is pitching the State Bureau right now. If they take the case, we hand over the evidence and step back. If they don't, Cade paused. Then we figure out what comes next. There's something else, Preacher said. He uncrossed his arms and stepped forward. His expression had changed. The caution was still there, but underneath it was something darker, a reluctance, like a man about to open a door he knew he couldn't close. I made some calls last night, after you all left. I called a friend in Ashburn who does property research, title searches, lien histories, that kind of thing. I asked her to pull everything on Meridian Holdings. And? Preacher reached into his cut and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He laid it on the table and unfolded it. It was a printed list, addresses, parcel numbers, dates of acquisition. Meridian Holdings owns 63 properties in the Tri-County area, most of them acquired in the last 5 years. Foreclosures, tax sales, abandoned parcels, nothing unusual on the surface. It looks like a standard land aggregation play. Buy cheap, wait for development permits, sell high. But, Cade said, 17 of those properties were acquired within 90 days of the previous owner filing a complaint with county services. Noise complaints, zoning disputes, water access issues, all minor stuff. And in 11 of those 17 cases, the previous owner underwent a psychiatric evaluation by county mental health services before the property changed hands. The room contracted. Cade felt it. A physical sensation, like the walls had taken a half step inward. 11 people, he said. 11 evaluations, all signed by Warren Kessler, all concluding that the subject was experiencing some form of instability, paranoia, anxiety disorder, delusional thinking. And in every single case, the subject either voluntarily surrendered the property within weeks of the evaluation or, Preacher stopped. Or what? Or disappeared, like Vanessa. How many? Rooster asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. 3 others besides Vanessa. 2 men and a woman, all classified as voluntary departures, no active investigations, no follow-up. The silence that fell over the room was the worst kind, the silence of recognition. The moment when the scale of something becomes visible and the mind has to recalibrate everything it thought it understood. This wasn't one kidnapping. This wasn't one corrupt developer getting rid of one inconvenient woman. This was a system, built, tested, repeated, refined over years. A machine designed to acquire property by destroying the credibility and then the existence of anyone who stood in its way. And at its center, 2 men. Victor Caldwell, providing the money and the political cover, Warren Kessler providing the clinical justification, operating in plain sight, protected by a local government that either participated willingly or looked away for the right price. 4 people, Dutch said. His voice had gone hollow. 4 people vanished and nobody, not the police, not the courts, not a single journalist, noticed a pattern. Nobody noticed because the pattern was designed not to be noticed, Preacher said. Each case is isolated. Different property, different timeline, different circumstances on the surface. The only common thread is Kessler's evaluations, and those are sealed medical documents. You'd need a court order or a very motivated detective to even see them side by side. Graves, Cade said. Graves has been trying to get access to those records for 2 years. That's what he meant when he said he kept getting stonewalled. He could see the edges of the pattern, but couldn't get close enough to document the center. Until now. Until now. Preacher folded the paper and put it back in his cut. Vanessa's phone changes everything. Kessler calling a victim's burner phone 14 times isn't a medical consultation. It's direct evidence of participation in whatever happened to her. Combined with the text messages, it's enough to justify a warrant for Kessler's records. And once those records open, the entire pattern becomes visible. Cade's mind was moving fast now, faster than it had moved in years. The tactical part of his brain, the part that had been dormant since he'd left the service, was firing on all cylinders. He could see the shape of it, the chain of evidence, the sequence of revelations, the dominoes that would fall if the right one was pushed first. And he could see the danger. Caldwell knows we have the phone, Cade said. He burned the farmhouse to destroy evidence. When he finds out the phone survived, he won't send 2 men with a gas can. He'll send lawyers first. Injunctions, cease and desist orders, maybe even criminal charges against us for trespassing and evidence tampering. And if the lawyers don't work, then he sends something else, Rooster finished. So we move fast. Cade looked at each man. Rooster, take the evidence to the storage unit now. Don't stop, don't deviate, don't tell anyone where you're going. Dutch, Loomis, I need you at the shop. If anyone comes here while Rooster's out, I want eyes at every door. And me? Preacher asked. You're going to Ashburn, to the Women's Crisis Center that Vanessa was calling. If she reached out to them for help, they might have records. Intake forms, case notes, something that tells us what she was afraid of and who she was afraid of. It corroborates everything on the phone. Preacher nodded slowly. I know people there. Volunteer intake coordinator named Sienna Grant. She's solid. Then go. The men moved. Engines started in the lot. Rooster's heavy rumble first, then Preacher's, both pulling out and disappearing into the gray curtain of rain. Dutch and Loomis took positions without being told. Dutch at the front bay with a clear sight line down the main road. Loomis at the back entrance, sitting on an overturned crate with his phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Cade went upstairs. Matt was in the kitchenette with Jules, eating cereal from a chipped bowl. The boy looked up when Cade appeared. His eyes were puffy from sleep and crying, but the steadiness was still there. That unnatural, hard-won composure that should not exist in a 10-year-old but did, because the world had demanded it. "Did something happen?" Matt asked. "We're making progress," Cade said. "It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the truth either. It was the kind of thing you said to a child when the truth was a blade and the lie was a blanket, and you chose the blanket because sometimes protection matters more than honesty." Matt studied him for a long moment. Then he went back to his cereal. At 9:22 a.m., Graves called. "Holt's in," he said. His voice was different, energized, with an edge of triumph that hadn't been there before. "She's opening a state-level investigation into Meridian Holdings. Fraud, corruption, conspiracy. And she's requesting emergency warrants for Kessler's psychiatric records and Caldwell's financial documents." "How long for the warrants?" "Judge is reviewing today. Could have them by tonight, maybe tomorrow morning." "That's fast." "Holt has juice, and she's been looking for something like this. She told me the governor's office has been getting anonymous complaints about land fraud in the Tri-County area for over a year, but never had enough evidence to act. This is the match she needed." "And Vanessa?" Graves's energy dimmed. "The investigation into Meridian is separate from the search for Vanessa. Holt is prioritizing the financial and corruption angle because that's what gets warrants signed. Finding Vanessa is still technically a missing persons case, and that's still under county jurisdiction until the state formally takes over. Which means the same people who buried her case are still in charge of finding her. For now, I'm working on it. But Cade, the fastest way to find Vanessa is to break Kessler. Once his records are seized, once he sees the walls closing in, he's the weak link. A psychiatrist with a medical license has everything to lose. Caldwell's a developer with lawyers and money. Kessler's a man with a career, a reputation, and a family. When the pressure comes, he'll fold. And when he folds, he'll tell us where she is. If she's still alive." The words left Cade's mouth before he could stop them. They hung in the air between the phone and the silence. "I know," Graves said quietly. "I know." After the call, Cade stood in the doorway of the shop bay and watched the rain fall on the gravel. The drizzle had become a steady pour, cold and relentless, turning the lot into a shallow lake of gray water. The sky was the color of a bruise, dark purple at the edges, yellow-gray in the center, pressing down on the rooftops like a ceiling being lowered. His phone rang again. Not Graves this time. An unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Rourke." The voice was smooth, controlled, the kind of voice that belonged in a boardroom, shaped by years of speaking to people who had no choice but to listen. "My name is Warren Kessler." Cade's entire body went still. Every muscle, every nerve, every breath locked in place like a machine with its gears jammed. He pressed the phone harder against his ear. "I understand you've come into possession of certain materials that belong to a former patient of mine," Kessler continued. "I'm calling to request their return." "You're calling me directly." "I prefer direct communication. It avoids misunderstandings." 14 times in 3 days, that's how many times you called Vanessa Mercer's phone. Was that direct communication too? Silence. 2 seconds. 3. When Kessler spoke again, the smoothness had thinned by a fraction, like a veneer developing a hairline crack. "Mrs. Mercer was a troubled woman. She was under my care. My calls were welfare checks, nothing more. Welfare checks don't usually come with threats." "I don't know what you're referring to." "You were warned. That's what you texted her the night before she disappeared." "What exactly was she warned about, Doctor?" The crack widened. Cade could hear it, a shift in breathing, a slight quickening of pace. The controlled exterior was holding, but underneath it something was moving. "Mr. Rourke, I'm reaching out as a courtesy. The materials in your possession contain protected medical information. Their unauthorized retention is a violation of federal privacy law. I'm prepared to overlook the circumstances of their acquisition if they're returned promptly and quietly. You want me to give you back the evidence that proves you helped kidnap a woman. I want to prevent a regrettable situation from escalating further." Regrettable. Cade tasted the word. It was acid on his tongue. A woman is missing. Her son is sleeping on a cot in my shop because the foster system you helped engineer failed him. And you're standing wherever you're standing, in whatever clean, warm office you make your calls from, using the word regrettable. Be very careful, Mr. Rourke. Or what? You'll have someone burn down my shop the way you burned down the farmhouse? Dead silence. I don't know anything about a fire. No. You just know about the evidence that was inside the house before the fire started, which means either you have the worst timing in history or you knew exactly what was going to happen to that property. Cade's voice had dropped. Low, flat. The voice of a man who had spent years in places where the line between conversation and combat was measured in milliseconds. Here's what's going to happen, Doctor. I'm not returning anything. Your name and your phone number are already in the hands of investigators who don't answer to Harlan County. And every hour that passes without Vanessa Mercer being found is an hour that makes your situation worse. You're making a mistake. I've made a lot of mistakes. This isn't one of them. He hung up. His hand was shaking, not with fear, with a rage so dense and compressed it felt like something physical, like a piece of metal lodged in his chest, vibrating at a frequency that made his teeth ache. Kessler had called him directly, which meant Kessler knew who he was, which meant Caldwell knew who he was, which meant the machine that had made Vanessa Mercer disappear now had its gaze fixed on Cade Rourke and the Iron Circle, and a 10-year-old boy sleeping above a motorcycle shop in Redfield. He called Graves immediately and relayed the conversation. The detective listened without interrupting. He's panicking, Graves said. That call was a mistake, a desperate one. He knows the phone exists and he's trying to retrieve it before the warrants come through. The fact that he reached out directly means he doesn't trust the usual channels anymore. Caldwell's lawyers, the local contacts, he's freelancing. That makes him dangerous. That makes him sloppy, and sloppy people make evidence. I'll have Holt add the call to the warrant application. Contacting a witness in an active investigation, even one he doesn't know is active yet, is obstruction. We're tightening the noose. But Graves's confidence didn't touch the cold spreading through Cade's stomach, because Kessler's call had revealed something else, something worse than panic. Kessler had said materials that belonged to a former patient. Former. Not current. Not missing. Former. As if Vanessa Mercer's case was already closed in his mind, as if the woman herself was already past tense. The afternoon passed in a state of armed waiting. Rooster returned at 1 p.m., confirmed the evidence was secured, and took a position at the front of the shop without being asked. Preacher came back from Ashburn at 3, his face set in an expression that Cade had seen exactly twice before, both times right before bad news arrived. Sit down, Preacher said. They sat at the long table. Matt was upstairs with Jules, out of earshot. The rain hammered the roof. The wood stove hissed where droplets leaked through a seam in the metal chimney pipe. I talked to Sienna Grant at the crisis center, Preacher said. Vanessa called their hotline 6 times in the 2 weeks before she disappeared. Sienna took 3 of those calls personally. What did she say? Vanessa was scared. Not vague scared, specific. She told Sienna that a man connected to a development company had been pressuring her to sell her home. When she refused, the pressure escalated. Strange cars outside her house, a man following her to the convenience store where she worked, her landlord suddenly claiming code violations that had never been cited before. And then Kessler. And then Kessler. Vanessa told Sienna she was forced into a psychiatric evaluation after her landlord reported concerns about her behavior. She said the evaluation was a setup, that Kessler asked leading questions, ignored her answers, and wrote a report that made her sound unhinged. She said she felt like she was being erased. Preacher stopped. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. There's more, he said. Go. On her last call to the crisis center, Vanessa told Sienna something that Sienna didn't fully understand at the time. She said, he has others. I'm not the first. There are others, and nobody knows where they went. Sienna asked what she meant, but Vanessa wouldn't elaborate. She just kept saying, find them. If something happens to me, find the others. The others. The 3 names on Preacher's list, 2 men and a woman. All disappeared. All connected to Meridian Holdings. All evaluated by Kessler. Sienna's willing to testify? Cade asked. Yes, She's been carrying this for 6 weeks and nobody's asked her. She was relieved someone finally did. Cade nodded. The picture was almost complete now. The evidence was piling up in layers. The phone, the call records, the property data, the crisis center logs, the psychiatric evaluation pattern. Each piece alone might be explained away. Together, they formed a structure so clear and so damning that no amount of political protection could sustain it. But Vanessa was still missing. The others were still missing. And the man who held the key to their location, Warren Kessler, was panicking, making desperate calls, and behaving like someone who knew the clock was running out. At 5:47 p.m., Graves called again. "Warrants are signed," he said. "Holt's team executes tomorrow morning. Kessler's office records, his home computer, and Meridian Holdings' financial documents. Caldwell's lawyers will fight it, but the warrants are sealed. He won't know until the agents are at the door." "And Vanessa?" I pressed Holt on that. "She's adding a welfare check to the warrant execution. If Kessler's records contain any indication of where Vanessa or the others are being held, the State Bureau has authority to act immediately." If, Graves paused. "Cade, I need to tell you something. I ran a background check on Kessler after your call. Standard stuff, property records, vehicle registrations, financial disclosures. And he owns a property that doesn't appear in any of the Meridian Holdings records, a maintenance facility about 30 miles south of the county line. Industrial property, listed as a storage and equipment depot for a construction company that dissolved 4 years ago. The title is in his wife's maiden name. It doesn't show up on any county database because it technically sits in a jurisdictional gap between 2 counties. Neither one claims it. A ghost property. Exactly. No inspections, no utilities on record, no tax assessments. It's a building that, on paper, doesn't exist." Cade's heart was beating in his ears. "You think she's there?" "I think if you wanted to keep someone alive but invisible, that's exactly the kind of place you'd use. Remote, unregistered, and belonging to a man with the credentials to explain away any medical equipment or supplies found on the premises." Alive. The word sat in Cade's chest like something trying to ignite. He couldn't let it, not yet. Hope was gasoline, and one spark could burn through every rational thought he had left. "Can Holt add it to the warrant?" "It's in a different jurisdiction. She'd need a separate warrant from a different judge. That takes time." "How much time?" "Maybe 48 hours. "We don't have 48 hours. Kessler called me this morning. He knows we have the phone. He knows the walls are closing in. If he has Vanessa at that facility, the first thing he'll do when the warrants hit is destroy whatever's there." The silence on the line was the silence of a man arriving at the same conclusion and hating where it led. "I can't tell you to go there," Graves said carefully. "As a law enforcement officer, I cannot advise civilians to approach a potentially dangerous location in connection with an active investigation." "I understand. Anything found during an unauthorized entry could be challenged in court." "I understand. But if someone were to be in the vicinity of that property and happened to hear sounds of distress from inside a structure, sounds that indicated a person in immediate danger, that would constitute exigent circumstances. And under exigent circumstances, private citizens have a legal right to render aid." Cade closed his eyes. "Send me the address." "It's already in your texts." The line went dead. Cade opened the message. An address, a GPS pin, and one final line from Graves. "I'll be 30 minutes behind you. Don't wait for me if you hear something." He put the phone in his pocket and walked into the shop. Every member of the Iron Circle was there. Rooster by the door, Dutch at the table, Loomis by the stove, Preacher against the wall, Jules at the bottom of the stairs. They all looked at him, and they all knew. Before he said a word, they knew. "We have a location," Cade said. "A property Kessler hid off the books. Graves thinks Vanessa might be there. The state can't get a warrant in time. If we wait, she might not be there when they arrive." Nobody spoke. The rain filled the silence. "This is not a club vote," Cade said. "This is personal. I'm riding south tonight. Anyone who comes, comes. Anyone who doesn't, I understand." Rooster straightened up from the doorframe. "What time?" "Before dawn." "I'll gas up." Dutch stood, Loomis stood, Jules took a breath and nodded. Preacher was the last. He looked at Cade for a long time. 10 seconds, 15, the longest silence of the day. Everything unspoken between them, from the farmhouse, from the argument about Laura, from every disagreement about cost and consequence, all of it was in that look. Then Preacher pushed off the wall. I'll make the calls. We're going to need more than 6 bikes for this. How many can you get? By morning? 30? Maybe more. Get them. Preacher pulled out his phone and walked outside into the rain. Through the window, Cade could see him pacing in the gravel lot, the phone pressed to his ear, his free hand cutting through the air as he spoke. Whatever reluctance had been holding him back was gone. The decision had been made, and Preacher was a man who, once committed, committed completely. Cade went upstairs. Matt was sitting on the cot in the storage room, awake, his mother's jacket on his lap. The boy looked up. You found something, Matt said. Not a question. Cade knelt in front of him. The floor was cold through his jeans. The light from the single bulb overhead cast shadows that made the boy's face look carved from something harder than flesh. We have a place to look, Cade said. We're going there in the morning. Is she there? I don't know. Maybe. Matt's fingers tightened on the jacket. His eyes, those old eyes in that young face, searched Cade's expression for the lie and didn't find one, because Cade wasn't lying. He genuinely didn't know. The possibility was alive and terrifying in equal measure. Can I come? No. But, Matt. Cade put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He could feel the bones under the fabric, too close to the surface, the architecture of a body that hadn't been properly fed in weeks. I need you to stay here. Jules is going to be with you. You'll be safe. I don't care about safe. I care about finding my mom. I know. And that's exactly why you need to stay. Because if we find her, the first thing she's going to need is to see you. And you need to be here for that. Rested. Ready. Okay? The boy's lip trembled, one single tremor, quickly controlled. He nodded. Cade squeezed his shoulder and stood up. At the door he paused. Matt. Yeah? That map you drew, the one your mom hid for you. She drew it. Right, she drew it. She made a plan. She thought ahead. She was smart enough and strong enough to prepare for the worst thing that could happen. He looked back at the boy. Someone that smart, someone that tough. They don't go down easy. Remember that. He closed the door halfway and went downstairs. The night unfolded in a quiet storm of preparation. Phone calls, text chains, messages sent through channels that ran deeper than any cell network. The word-of-mouth infrastructure that connected motorcycle clubs across county lines, across state lines, across the invisible boundaries of loyalty and code. By midnight, Preacher had confirmed 31 riders. By 2 a.m., 36. Men from 3 different chapters, some of them riding over 100 miles through freezing rain because a child's mother was in danger and the Iron Circle had asked for help. At 4 a.m., the rain stopped. The silence that replaced it was immense. Cade stood in the parking lot behind the shop, his leather vest zipped to his throat, his breath making clouds in the frozen air. Around him, the first bikes were arriving, headlights cutting through the dark, engines growling low, riders pulling in 1 and 2 at a time and parking in rows that grew longer as the minutes passed. No one joked. No one raised their voice. The gravity of what they were about to do was written on every face, carried in every silence, understood without a single briefing, because these were men who recognized the weight of a moment that could change the trajectory of lives, including their own. By 4:45, 36 motorcycles sat in formation in the lot behind the Iron Circle shop. 36 engines ticking in the cold, 36 men waiting for a word. Cade mounted his Harley. The engine caught on the first kick and settled into its deep, familiar rumble, a sound that had been his heartbeat for 8 years, the only thing in his life that had never disappointed him. He looked at Rooster, at Preacher, at Dutch, and Loomis, and the 30 faces he didn't know but trusted because they had shown up in the dark and the cold for a woman they had never met. He thought about Matt upstairs, about the jacket, about the word Mama cried into the floorboards at 2 in the morning. He pulled out of the lot. 36 engines followed, and 30 miles to the south, in a windowless room inside a building that didn't exist on any map, Vanessa Mercer heard a sound she hadn't heard in 43 days. Not an engine, not a voice, a silence. a change in the silence. The kind of shift that happens when something far away begins to move, and the air itself changes pressure, and the world holds its breath because it knows what's coming. She pressed her ear against the cold wall and listened. The convoy moved south through the last hour of darkness like a single living organism. 36 motorcycles in tight formation, their headlights cutting parallel lines through the frozen air, their engines creating a harmonic so deep and constant it vibrated in the chest cavity before it reached the ears. The sound traveled across the flat farmland in every direction, rolling over empty fields and dormant crop rows and the skeletal remains of barns that hadn't housed anything alive in decades. Cade rode at the front. The wind was ablade. 23 degrees, no cloud cover, the stars hard and bright overhead like holes punched in sheet metal. His hands were numb inside his gloves, and he didn't care. His jaw was locked and his eyes were fixed on the road ahead and inside his skull, a single thought repeated with the rhythm of the engine. She's alive. She has to be alive. 43 days. People survive 43 days. Behind him, Rooster rode 2 lengths back and 1 lane to the right, the position of a wingman, a bodyguard, a man whose job was to see the things the point rider couldn't. His scarred face was unreadable behind his helmet visor, but his body language was that of a coiled mechanism. Weight forward, shoulders square, hands loose on the bars with the deceptive relaxation of someone ready to react in a fraction of a second. Preacher rode third in formation. He had his phone mounted on his handlebars, the GPS tracking the pin Graves had sent. 31 miles to the location, then 24, then 18. The distance shrank with each passing minute, and with it, the space between preparation and consequence. At the 12-mile mark, Preacher pulled alongside Cade and tapped his helmet twice, the iron circle signal for stop and talk. Cade raised his fist. The convoy decelerated in a ripple, 36 bikes slowing in sequence until they were idling on the shoulder of a 2-lane county road bordered by dead cornfields. "Half-mile ahead, there's a crossroads," Preacher said, his voice raised above the idling engines. "We split there. Main group continues south on this road. It dead ends into the access road for the facility. Second group, 8 bikes, takes the east fork and comes around the back. There's an old logging track that runs along the tree line. If there's a rear exit, we need it covered." "Who's running the second group?" Cade asked. "I am." Preacher's eyes were steady. Whatever philosophical debate had existed between them about whether this was the right move had been resolved by the act of showing up. He was here, he was committed, and now he was operating with the tactical precision that came from being a man who, when he decided to do something, refused to do it halfway. "Rooster stays with you up front," Preacher continued. "Dutch and Loomis on your flanks. The rest of the main group holds the perimeter, nobody in or out. We don't know how many people Caldwell has at that location. Could be 0. Could be a security detail. We go in expecting the worst. And if we find her? We get her out. Everything else is secondary." Cade nodded. He looked back at the column of bikes stretching into the darkness behind him. 36 riders. Men who had left warm beds and families and the comfort of uninvolvement because a 10-year-old's crayon map had led to a truth too ugly to ignore. He didn't know most of their names. He didn't need to. "Let's go," he said. The convoy split at the crossroads. 28 bikes continued south, 8 peeled east with Preacher, and vanished into the tree line like ghosts being swallowed by the dark. The access road appeared 4 minutes later, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt running between chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire. No gate, no guardhouse. Just a gap in the fence wide enough for a vehicle, the chain that once secured it hanging loose and coiled on the ground like a dead snake. Beyond the fence, the facility emerged from the darkness in pieces. A flat-roofed industrial building, maybe 8,000 square feet. Corrugated metal walls, a loading dock on the south side with a roll-up door. 2 smaller outbuildings flanking it, one that looked like a maintenance shed, one that might have been an office. A gravel yard in front, pocked with puddles from the previous day's rain that had frozen into sheets of black ice that reflected the motorcycle headlights like dark mirrors. No lights, no vehicles. The emptiness was wrong. Cade felt it in his gut. The same instinct that had kept him alive in places where the absence of people was more dangerous than their presence. An empty building in the middle of nowhere at 5 in the morning should feel abandoned. This felt vacated. Recently, deliberately. He cut his engine. The silence that followed was enormous. One by one, the other bikes went quiet. 28 engines dying in sequence until the only sounds were the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind across the gravel, and the distant, barely audible hum of a generator running somewhere inside the main building. A generator. In a facility that supposedly had no utilities on record. "You hear that?" Rooster said. He had already dismounted and was standing with his head tilted, listening. "Generator," Cade said. "Running power to something." Dutch came up on Cade's left. The big man's face was tight. "No vehicles, no security. Either nobody's home or they saw us coming and cleared out." "They didn't clear out," Loomis said. He was crouching near the ground by the fence gap, his phone flashlight illuminating the gravel. "Fresh tire tracks, 2 sets. One coming in, one going out. The outbound tracks are on top of the inbound, meaning someone left after someone arrived." He stood up. "Recently. These tracks aren't frozen yet. The water in them is still liquid. Someone had been here within the last few hours, had come, had done something, and had left." Cade's pulse was climbing. He could feel it in his neck, in his temples, in the tips of his fingers inside his gloves. The tactical part of his brain was screaming, "Slow down, assess, wait for Preacher's team to get in position." The other part, the part that had been awake for 30 hours and was thinking about a boy sleeping above a motorcycle shop with his mother's jacket pressed against his face, was screaming, "Move." He keyed the 2-way radio clipped to his vest. "Preacher, you in position?" Static. Then, "East side, tree line. We have eyes on the back of the main building. There's a steel door, no exterior handle, one window, blacked out, no movement. We're going in from the front, loading dock. Give us 60 seconds, then hold the back. Copy." Cade looked at Rooster, at Dutch, at Loomis, at the riders behind them, silent, waiting, their breath making ghosts in the frozen air. "Stay quiet. Stay tight. If someone's inside, we don't know their situation. Could be armed, could be a civilian, could be a trap. We clear the building room by room. Nobody goes cowboy." Rooster reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight with a metal housing, the kind that could light up a room and break a jaw with equal efficiency. Dutch produced a pry bar from his bike. Loomis had nothing in his hands and needed nothing. His eyes were enough. They moved across the gravel yard in a loose wedge formation. Cade at point, Rooster right, Dutch left, Loomis trailing. The rest of the riders spread along the perimeter fence, creating a human net around the property that nothing larger than a field mouse could have slipped through. The loading dock was 3 feet off the ground. Cade hauled himself up, his boots scraping against the concrete lip, and pressed himself flat against the roll-up door. It was cold metal against his cheek. He listened. The generator hum was louder here, a steady mechanical pulse coming from somewhere deep inside the structure. Underneath it, another sound, or the absence of a sound, a quality of silence that was different from empty building silence. This was the silence of a space that was occupied, that had mass and presence inside it, that was holding its breath. The roll-up door had a manual release, a pull chain on the lower left. Dutch gripped it with both hands and looked at Cade. Cade nodded. Dutch pulled. The chain rattled. The lock disengaged, and the door began to rise on its track with a shriek of rusted metal that split the silence like a scream. The interior was dark. Flashlight beams cut through the space and revealed a cavernous concrete room, the main warehouse floor. Industrial shelving along the walls, mostly empty. A forklift in the corner, tires flat, stacks of pallets. The smell was dust and motor oil and cold concrete, and underneath everything, something else, something organic and wrong. The smell of a space that had been used to keep a living thing in conditions that were not meant for living things. "Generators that way," Rooster said, his light tracking a heavy-gauge extension cord that ran across the floor and disappeared through a doorway at the back of the warehouse. They followed the cord, through the doorway, down a corridor, narrow, unpainted drywall, the kind of hasty construction that happens when someone converts an industrial space for a purpose it was never designed for. Fluorescent light tubes overhead, 1 in 3 working, casting a buzzing, intermittent glow that made the shadows jump. The corridor ended at a steel door, not an industrial door. A residential door, heavy gauge, with a deadbolt and a hasp for a padlock. The padlock was open, hanging from the hasp like a severed hand. The extension cord ran under the door. Cade's hand was on the door handle. His other hand was flat against the steel surface. He could feel the vibration of the generator through the metal, could feel the cold radiating from the other side, could feel something else. The unmistakable pressure of a space that contained a human being. He turned the handle. The door opened. The room was maybe 12 by 10. Concrete floor, concrete walls. A single window high up on the far wall, painted black from the outside. The generator sat in the corner, a portable unit, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store, running on gasoline, connected by extension cord to a single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling and a small space heater that was barely warming the air. A mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a plastic jug of water half empty, a stack of canned food, some opened, some not, a spoon. And on the mattress, pressed against the far wall with her knees drawn to her chest and her arms wrapped around herself, was a woman. She was thin, thinner than the photograph. Her dark hair hung around her face in matted tangles. Her skin was gray, the gray of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Her eyes were open, and they were enormous, and they were locked on the doorway with an expression that contained so many things at once: terror, disbelief, hope, the defense mechanism of someone who had been told so many times that help was coming. And it never did, that she had stopped believing in the concept entirely. She was wearing a thermal shirt and sweatpants that were too large for her. No shoes, her feet were dirty, and her hands were trembling, and her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. Cade froze in the doorway. The flashlight beam trembled in Rooster's hand, the first time anyone had ever seen Rooster's hand shake. "Vanessa," Cade said. His voice came out wrong, cracked, rough, thick with something that was trying to push its way up from his chest and through his throat. He swallowed and tried again. "Vanessa Mercer." The woman's lips stopped moving. She stared at him, at the leather vest, at the iron circle patch, at the faces crowding the doorway behind him. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her body making itself as small as possible. The involuntary compression of someone who had learned that people entering rooms brought pain. "My name is Cade Rourke," he said. He didn't step forward, didn't move, made himself as still and as unthreatening as a man his size could make himself, which wasn't very, but it was all he had. "Your son sent me." The change in her face was seismic, not a single expression, a sequence so fast they overlapped. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. And then something that broke through every defense she had built over 43 days of captivity, like a flood breaching a dam. "Matt?" she whispered. The word was a rasp. Her vocal cords sounded like they hadn't been used in weeks. "He's safe. He's waiting for you." "Matt." She said it again and again. Each repetition was louder, stronger, as if the name itself was pulling her back from wherever she had gone inside herself. "Matt. My Matt. Is he okay? Did they hurt him?" "He's okay. He's safe. He's been brave as hell." She broke. Not the way Matt had broken at the farmhouse, a child's total defenseless collapse. This was a woman's breaking, slower, deeper. The sound that came out of her was not a scream and not a sob, but something between a release of pressure so immense that it seemed to physically change the shape of her body, her shoulders dropping, her head falling forward, her hands uncovering her face for the first time to reveal cheeks that were hollow and eyes that were red-rimmed and lips that were cracked, and a face that, underneath all the damage, still carried the same fierce, tired beauty of the woman in the photograph holding her son in the August sun. Cade moved forward, slowly. 1 step, 2. He knelt in front of the mattress the way he had knelt in front of Matt at the farmhouse. One knee on the cold concrete, hands visible, voice low. "We're going to get you out of here," he said. "Can you stand?" She tried. Her legs shook. She got halfway up and her knees buckled, and Cade caught her, one arm around her back, taking her weight, feeling how little of her there was. She weighed nothing. She was made of bone and will in 43 days of refusing to die, and she clung to him with the grip of someone who had been drowning and had just been thrown a line. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you." Rooster was already on the radio. "Preacher, we have her. She's alive. Get the trucks to the loading dock. We need blankets and water." "Copy. Moving now." Dutch had tears on his face. He wasn't wiping them. Loomis was standing in the corridor with his back to the room, his shoulders rigid, his head bowed. Behind them, the men who had followed into the building stood in a loose cluster, and not one of them was unaffected. Hard men. Road-worn men. Men with criminal records and broken marriages and scars they'd never explain. And every single one of them was watching a starving woman being helped to her feet in a concrete cell, and every single one of them was feeling the same thing. A rage so vast it had nowhere to go except into silence. They moved Vanessa through the corridor and into the warehouse. She couldn't walk without support. Cade held her on one side, Rooster on the other, and they moved slowly, carefully, as if carrying something that might shatter, which, in a sense, they were. In the warehouse, light was beginning to filter through the gaps in the loading dock door. Dawn. The first gray suggestion of it, colorless and cold, but after 43 days in a room with a painted-over window, it was the most beautiful thing Vanessa Mercer had ever seen. She stopped walking. She stood in the loading dock opening and looked at the sky. Her face tilted upward, her eyes closed, her chest expanded with a breath so deep and so long that it seemed to pull air not just into her lungs, but into every starved and oxygen-deprived cell in her body. "Outside," she said. "I want to be outside." They helped her down from the dock. She stood on the gravel in her bare feet. Freezing gravel, sharp gravel, gravel that must have hurt. And she didn't flinch. She stood there and she breathed and she looked at the sky turning from black to gray, and her tears fell without sound. Preacher's team had come around from the east side. 8 more bikes, more men. Blankets appeared, heavy wool blankets from someone's saddlebag, the kind bikers carried for roadside breakdowns. Preacher draped one over Vanessa's shoulders, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man with hands that large. "An ambulance is on the way," Preacher said to Cade. 15 minutes. "Graves?" 20 minutes behind us. He's bringing state agents." Cade nodded. He looked at Vanessa, who was sitting now on the loading dock edge, wrapped in 2 blankets, holding a bottle of water that she sipped with excruciating slowness, the caution of someone whose stomach had shrunk to the size of a fist. "Vanessa," Cade said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that you don't have to answer right now if you can't." She looked at him, those enormous, damaged eyes. "Who did this to you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke, and her voice was stronger now. Still raw, still rough, but carrying a clarity that came from having spent 43 days with nothing to do but think about exactly this moment. "Warren Kessler brought me here. The night after I refused to sign the property papers. 2 men I'd never seen came to my house at 1 in the morning. Kessler was in the car. He told me it was a voluntary psychiatric hold, that I was a danger to myself and my son, and that if I cooperated, I would be home in 72 hours. Her hands tightened around the water bottle. I wasn't home in 72 hours. I was here, in that room, for 43 days. And Caldwell? Caldwell is the money. Kessler is the hands. But it's not just them." She looked at Cade with an expression that carried a warning as clear as a siren. "There's a man inside the county sheriff's department, a lieutenant. He signed off on the case closure. He's the one who made sure nobody looked for me." "Do you know his name?" "Lieutenant James Harlan. He was in the car with Kessler the night they took me." The name dropped into the circle of bikers like a grenade. A sheriff's lieutenant, not a bureaucrat buried in paperwork. A ranking officer with a badge and a gun and the authority to direct investigations and bury evidence and make people disappear from the system with the stroke of a pen. This wasn't corruption at the edges. This was corruption at the core. "Is Harlan here now?" Cade asked. "He was here 2 days ago. He brought food. He told me the case was closed and that nobody was coming." Her jaw tightened. "He said Matt had been placed with a family and was adjusting well. He said I should accept my situation." "Your situation?" That's what he called it. Vanessa's voice hardened to a point so sharp it could have drawn blood. "He sat in that room and ate a sandwich while I sat on a mattress, and he called my kidnapping a situation. He's not calling it anything anymore. Rooster said. His voice was low and flat and carrying the weight of something that wanted very badly to be violence and was being held in check by the thinnest possible margin of self-control. Sirens, distant but approaching. The ambulance. "There's more," Vanessa said. She was looking at her hands, at the water bottle, at the ground. "The others." "We know about the others," Cade said. "Preacher found the pattern. 3 people who disappeared in connection with Meridian Properties." "Not 3. Vanessa's eyes came up. 5. The number hit the group like a physical force. 2 of them were before Kessler's time, before the psychiatric evaluation scheme. They were handled differently, pressured out of their properties through legal threats, intimidation, physical harassment. One man, Daniel Oakes, refused to leave. He had a fire at his property. Insurance ruled it arson, but nobody was charged. He moved away. The other, a woman named Helen Darrow, she signed over her property after her dog was killed and someone left a note on her windshield with her daughter's school schedule. And the 3 after? The 3 after were Kessler's, Rebecca Shaw, Marcus Trent, Jorge Elizondo, all evaluated, all declared unstable, all disappeared. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Kessler told me about them. In this room. He told me what happened to them as a warning. He said they were relocated. That was his word. He said they were alive and living in other states under different circumstances and that if I cooperated, I would be relocated too. Do you believe him? I don't know. I don't know anything about where they are. But I know one thing. Kessler is afraid of Caldwell. Deeply, genuinely afraid. And men who are afraid do terrible things to stay on the right side of the people they fear. The ambulance appeared at the end of the access road. Lights flashing, no siren now, moving slowly across the gravel. Behind it, 2 unmarked sedans. Behind those, a state police cruiser. Graves stepped out of the lead sedan before it had fully stopped. He was wearing the same canvas jacket, the same jeans, the same 3-day beard, but his face was transformed. The tiredness was still there, but it had been overwritten by something electric, the look of a man who had been pushing against a locked door for 2 years and had just heard the bolt slide open. Behind him, a woman stepped out of the second sedan. 50s. Short gray hair, black overcoat. Her face carried the composed authority of someone who had spent a career making decisions that ended careers and began prosecutions. She looked at the facility, at the bikers, at the woman wrapped in blankets on the loading dock, and her expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Something in them went from professional assessment to personal understanding in the space of a single breath. Catherine Holt, the State Bureau Deputy Director. "Is this Vanessa Mercer?" Holt asked. "Yes," Cade said. Holt walked to the loading dock. She knelt in front of Vanessa with a movement that was surprisingly gentle for a woman who radiated bureaucratic steel. "Mrs. Mercer, I'm Deputy Director Catherine Holt with the State Bureau of Investigation. You're safe now. We're going to get you medical attention and then, when you're ready, I need your statement. Everything you can tell us." "I can tell you everything right now," Vanessa said. "You need a doctor first." "I've waited 43 days. The doctor can wait 30 minutes. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. She turned to Graves. "Get a recorder and get that building sealed. I want forensic teams in there within the hour." The paramedics moved in. They checked Vanessa's vitals. Blood pressure low, heart rate elevated, signs of malnutrition and dehydration, and the beginning stages of muscle atrophy in her lower extremities. They wrapped her in thermal blankets and started an IV and did everything they could while she sat on the dock and refused to move until she had said what she needed to say. Graves held the recorder. Holt stood beside him. Vanessa spoke. She spoke for 27 minutes without stopping. She gave them dates, names, times, descriptions. She described the night of her abduction, the car, the men, Kessler's voice in the dark, the smell of the cleaning solution they used on the room before they put her in it. She described the routine, food delivery twice a day for the first week, then once a day, then every other day when they realized nobody was looking. She described Kessler's visits, always at night, always alone, always carrying the same folder of documents he wanted her to sign. Property transfer agreements, voluntary relocation consent forms, papers designed to make her disappearance look legal after the fact. She described Lieutenant Harlan's visits, the casual cruelty of a man who treated her captivity as an administrative inconvenience, the sandwich he ate in front of her while explaining that her son had stopped asking about her. And she described the last visit, 4 days ago. Kessler, visibly agitated, pacing the room, telling her that something had changed, that there were problems, that she needed to sign the papers immediately, or the situation, that word again, would become more complicated. She had refused. Again. For the 43rd time in 43 days. Kessler had left without speaking. And for 4 days after that, nobody had come. No food, no water, no visits. She had survived on what was left in the room, 2 cans of beans and half a jug of water. And she had pressed her ear against the wall every hour, listening for the sound of an engine that might mean someone was coming. What she heard instead, at 5:04 this morning, was the rumble of 36 motorcycles pulling into the gravel yard. The silence after she finished was sacred. Nobody violated it. Even the wind had stopped. Then Holt spoke. "Detective Graves, contact the State Police Barracks. I want arrest warrants for Warren Kessler and Victor Caldwell drawn up within the hour. And I want a separate warrant for Lieutenant James Harlan of the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. Charges: kidnapping, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and false imprisonment. Have the state police execute all 3 warrants simultaneously. I don't want any of them getting a phone call before the handcuffs go on." "Yes, ma'am," Graves said. He was already dialing. Cade stood at the edge of the loading dock and watched the sky brighten. The sun wasn't visible yet. It was still behind the tree line to the east, but the light was spreading, turning the gray into silver, the silver into pale gold, the pale gold into something that felt like the first morning of a different world. His phone buzzed. A text from Jules. "Matt's awake. He's asking." "What do I tell him?" Cade looked at Vanessa. She was being helped into the ambulance now, the IV bag swinging from a hook above the stretcher, her face turned toward the open doors of the vehicle where the morning light was pouring in. He typed back, "Tell him we found her. Tell him she's alive. Tell him she's coming home." He hit send. And then he sat down on the concrete edge of the loading dock, among 36 motorcycles and their riders and the first sounds of sirens approaching from the north, and he put his face in his hands. Not because he was breaking, because something inside him for the first time in years was being put back together. And 40 miles north, in a house on the outskirts of Redfield, Jules held the phone and read the message, and looked at the boy standing in the doorway of the storage room with his mother's jacket clutched against his chest. "Matt?" Jules said. His voice cracked on the single syllable. The boy's eyes went wide, not with fear this time, with something else entirely. Something that had been buried so deep and held so tightly and protected so fiercely that when it finally broke the surface, it changed the shape of his entire face. "They found her?" Matt whispered. "They found her. She's alive." Matt didn't scream, didn't jump, didn't collapse. He stood perfectly still in the doorway holding the jacket, and the tears that ran down his face were silent and steady and unstoppable. They fell onto the fleece collar and darkened the fabric in spots. And he made no move to wipe them because there was no shame in them and no need to hide them and nothing left in the world to be afraid of. Then he sat down on the floor right there in the doorway, and he pressed his mother's jacket against his face, and he breathed in the last fading trace of her scent, and he waited, because she was coming home. And in a glass-walled office downtown, Victor Caldwell's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Deputy Director Catherine Holt with the State Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling to inform you that agents are en route to your office and your residence with warrants for your arrest. I advise you to remain where you are and to contact your attorney." The line went dead. Caldwell stood at his window. Below him, 3 state police cruisers were pulling into the building's parking garage, their lights flashing in silent rotation. He reached for his phone to call Kessler. Kessler's line was already dead. 3 agents were standing in his kitchen, reading him his rights, while his wife watched from the doorway in her bathrobe, her hand over her mouth. And at the county sheriff's department, Lieutenant James Harlan looked up from his desk to see 2 state troopers and an internal affairs investigator standing in his office doorway. The investigator was holding a warrant, The troopers were holding handcuffs. "James Harlan," the investigator said, "stand up." Harlan looked at the warrant, at the handcuffs, at the troopers' faces, which carried the expression of men performing a duty they had been waiting to perform for a very long time. He stood up. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The arrests happened simultaneously at 7:14 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and by noon the story had broken containment. A local television crew monitoring the state police scanner arrived at the county courthouse in time to film Victor Caldwell being escorted through the back entrance in handcuffs, his silver hair uncombed for the first time in public memory, his jaw set in the rigid expression of a man whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally rearranged in the space of a single phone call. His attorney, a trim, expensive woman in a charcoal suit who had been pulled from her breakfast table, walked beside him with her hand on his elbow and her mouth forming the words, "Say nothing," on a loop. Kessler arrived 20 minutes later. He looked worse. The smoothness that had characterized his voice on the phone with Cade was gone, replaced by a visible tremor in his hands and a grayish pallor that made him look like a man in the early stages of medical shock. His wife had not come. The officers who transported him said she had watched from the kitchen doorway as they walked him out and had not moved or spoken or cried. She had simply watched with the expression of a woman who had just discovered that the life she'd been living was a lie and hadn't yet decided what to do with that information. Lieutenant Harlan was processed separately at the state police barracks rather than the county courthouse, because putting a corrupt officer through the system he had corrupted was the kind of institutional insult that Catherine Holt refused to commit. He said nothing during processing. He signed his name where he was told to sign it, and looked straight ahead and kept his mouth closed with the discipline of a man who understood that from this point forward, every word he spoke was a potential weapon that could be used against him. By mid-afternoon, the story was on every regional news outlet and climbing toward national attention. A missing mother held captive for 43 days. A corrupt developer. A complicit psychiatrist. A sheriff's lieutenant who had signed off on burying the case. And at the center of it, a detail that the media latched onto with the kind of narrative hunger that turns local stories into national ones. A 10-year-old boy with a crayon map and a motorcycle club that had done what the entire system had failed to do. Cade watched none of it. He was at the hospital. Vanessa had been admitted to the county medical center, the nearest facility with a bed available, at 8:30 that morning. The doctors ran tests for 4 hours. Malnutrition, dehydration, muscle atrophy in her legs from weeks of limited movement, a respiratory infection that had been building in her lungs from the cold, damp conditions of the concrete room. Vitamin deficiencies. Anemia. The physical catalog of 43 days of captivity, itemized in clinical language on charts and forms that reduced a woman's suffering to numbers and abbreviations. But she was alive. That fact sat at the center of everything like a stone dropped into water, and the ripples from it moved outward and touched every other fact and recontextualized it. The malnutrition was treatable. The dehydration was reversible. The respiratory infection would respond to antibiotics. The muscle atrophy would improve with physical therapy. She was alive. And because she was alive, everything else was a problem with a solution rather than a tragedy without one. Cade sat in the hallway outside her room on a plastic chair that was too small for him, his leather vest still on, his boots leaving dried mud on the linoleum. He hadn't eaten since the diner. He hadn't slept in over 30 hours. His body was running on the chemical residue of adrenaline and purpose. And now that both were fading, the exhaustion was moving in like weather, slow, heavy, inescapable. Rooster was somewhere in the building. Preacher had gone back to Redfield to coordinate with the other chapter members who had ridden through the night. Dutch and Loomis had been released to go home, and they'd left with handshakes and nods and the kind of brief, loaded eye contact that said everything words would have fumbled. Jules was bringing Matt. They'd discussed it. Cade and the doctors and a hospital social worker who had been called in specifically for the reunion. The social worker wanted to manage the process. She wanted to prepare the child. She wanted to ensure a controlled environment with appropriate emotional support mechanisms in place. Cade had listened to her for about 90 seconds before he said, "His mother's been locked in a concrete room for a month and a half, and he's been carrying her jacket like a lifeline. He doesn't need a controlled environment. He needs his mom." The social worker had started to object. Then she'd looked at Cade. at his face, at his eyes, at the particular quality of conviction that radiated from him like heat from an engine block. And she'd closed her mouth and nodded and stepped aside. At 2:17 p.m., the elevator at the end of the hall opened, and Jules walked out with Matt beside him. The boy was wearing the same clothes he'd worn to the diner, the too big jeans, the faded coat, but someone, probably Jules, had found him a clean shirt and had tried to flatten his hair with water. The effort was visible and touching and completely futile, because Matt's hair had the stubborn wildness of a child who had been sleeping on a folding cot and crying into a jacket and not thinking about his appearance, because appearance was a luxury afforded to people whose worlds weren't falling apart. He was carrying the jacket. Of course he was. Matt saw Cade first. He stopped walking. His eyes moved from Cade to the door of the hospital room, and in that moment, the composure he had maintained since the diner, that extraordinary, terrible adult composure that no child should ever have to develop, cracked. "Is she in there?" Matt asked. "She's in there." Cade stood up from the plastic chair. His knees protested, his back protested, everything protested. He ignored all of it. "She's weak, Matt. She's been through a lot. She might look different than you remember, but she's her. She's your mom." Matt nodded. He was vibrating, not visibly, but Cade could feel it, a tremor running through the boy's entire body like a tuning fork struck and held. "Can I go in?" "Yeah, you can go in." Matt walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle, and then he stopped. He stood there for 3 seconds, an eternity in the life of a 10-year-old who had waited 43 days for this moment. And in those 3 seconds, Cade saw something pass across the boy's face that he would never forget. Not fear, not hesitation. It was the last moment of the version of Matt Mercer who had existed for the past 6 weeks. The version who had been alone, who had been abandoned by every system designed to protect him, who had walked through the cold with a crayon map and knocked on a door full of strangers. That version of Matt was about to cease to exist, replaced by the version who had his mother back. And the boy seemed to understand, in some instinctive, pre-verbal way, that this was a threshold and that crossing it would change everything. He opened the door. Cade didn't follow. He stood in the hallway and listened. He heard the door close. He heard footsteps, small, uncertain, crossing the room's linoleum floor. He heard a silence that was full to bursting with everything two people can feel when they see each other after believing they might never see each other again. And then he heard Vanessa's voice, stronger than it had been at the facility, carrying a resonance that only one person in the world could have given it, say a single word. "Baby." And then the sound of a boy running the last few steps, and the sound of a mother pulling her child onto a hospital bed and holding him with both arms, and the IV trailing from the back of her hand, and the sound of two people crying in a way that was not sad at all, but was something else entirely. The sound of a wound closing, of a gap being bridged, of a world that had been broken, being reassembled around the one thing that mattered. Cade sat back down on the plastic chair. He leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. The sounds from the room continued, muffled, intimate, not meant for anyone else. And he let them wash over him without trying to hear the words. Jules sat down beside him. The younger man didn't say anything for a while. Then, quietly, "You did a good thing, Cade." Cade didn't open his eyes. "We did a good thing." "No, I mean, all of us, yeah, but it was your call. Every step. You decided to believe that kid when anyone else would have called social services and gone back to their coffee. Someone had to. That's the point, isn't it? Someone has to. And it's usually the people who've already been through enough." Cade opened his eyes and looked at Jules. The younger man's face was earnest and tired and carrying the residue of an emotional experience that was going to take weeks to fully process. In that face, Cade could see the ghost of the person Jules had been before the Iron Circle. The kid sleeping in his car behind a truck stop, strung out and alone, waiting for someone to give a damn. And he could see the person Jules was becoming. Someone who showed up. Someone who held steady. Someone who stayed. "Go get some sleep," Cade said. "You first." "I'm not going anywhere." Jules studied him for a moment, then nodded. He stood up, put his hand on Cade's shoulder briefly, a gesture that was both farewell and gratitude and something deeper that neither of them would ever name. and walked to the elevator. Cade sat in the hallway for another hour. Nurses passed. Doctors passed. The social worker came back, looked at the closed door, listened to the sounds from inside, and decided not to knock. A state police officer arrived to post outside the room. A precaution Holt had ordered until all 3 suspects were fully processed and the scope of the conspiracy was mapped. At 4 p.m., Graves appeared. He looked like he'd been running on caffeine and purpose for 24 hours straight, which he had. His eyes were bloodshot and his canvas jacket was wrinkled, and there was a coffee stain on his shirt that he either hadn't noticed or didn't care about. He sat down across from Cade, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Kessler broke," Graves said. "Already?" Holt's team barely had to push. The moment his lawyer explained the charges, kidnapping, conspiracy, false imprisonment times 4, obstruction. He started talking. He's been talking for 3 hours. What did he say? Everything. Dates, locations, methods, how Caldwell identified targets, how Kessler conducted the evaluations, how Harlan ensured the cases were closed or deprioritized. Graves paused. And the others, Rebecca Shaw, Marcus Trent, Jorge Elizondo. They're alive. The word hit Cade like a physical force. He sat up straight. Where? Shaw and Trent were relocated, Kessler's word, to out-of-state locations. Shaw is in a long-term care facility in Indiana under a false name. Kessler had her committed using forged documents. She's been there for 11 months. Trent was moved to a halfway house in Missouri, also under a false identity, drugged into compliance with medications prescribed by Kessler. Graves's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. Elizondo is closer. He's in a facility similar to the one where we found Vanessa, another ghost property, this one about 60 miles east. State police are en route now. 3 people, alive, scattered across state lines, hidden behind false names and forged documents, erased from their own lives by a system designed to make the inconvenient disappear. And now, because a 10-year-old boy had refused to accept the story he was told and had walked into a diner with a crayon map, the system was collapsing. And the 2 from before Kessler? Cade asked. Daniel Oakes and Helen Darrow. Oakes left the state voluntarily after the arson. He's alive, living in Oregon. We're reaching out. Darrow signed over her property under duress. She moved to her sister's house in Kentucky. Both of them are potential witnesses if the case goes to trial. If? It'll go to trial. Holt is building a federal referral. The scope of this: forced institutionalization, false imprisonment across state lines, corruption of public officials. It's going to attract federal prosecutors like blood in the water. Caldwell's lawyers can delay, but they can't stop it. Cade leaned back in his chair. He felt something loosen in his chest. A constriction that had been there since the diner, since the moment Matt Mercer had unfolded a crayon map on a table and said, "I just need one ride." The constriction didn't disappear entirely. Some of it would stay. But it loosened enough for him to take a full breath for the first time in 2 days. "Thank you," Cade said. Graves shook his head. "Don't thank me. I spent 2 years filing reports that went nowhere and complaining about stonewalling and feeling sorry for myself. You and your guys did in 48 hours what I couldn't do in 24 months. You made the calls that mattered. Holt, the State Bureau, the warrants. None of this works without you. And none of this starts without the kid." Graves stood up. He extended his hand. Cade took it. The handshake was firm, brief, and carried the weight of 2 men who had found themselves on the same side of a line neither had expected to cross. "I'll be in touch. There'll be depositions, hearings. The club's involvement will come under scrutiny. Some people won't like that bikers did what the police should have done. Be ready for that. I've been unpopular before. I bet." A ghost of a smile crossed Graves's face, the first Cade had seen from the man. Then it was gone, replaced by the tired, determined expression that seemed to be his default setting. He nodded and walked down the hall. The days that followed moved at the pace of healing, which is to say slowly and unevenly, and with setbacks that were indistinguishable from progress, unless you were paying very close attention. Vanessa spent 4 days in the hospital. Matt did not leave her side for any of them. A fold-out chair was brought in for him, and then a cot, and then a proper bed when the hospital staff gave up pretending that the boy was going to be separated from his mother by anything short of force. He slept beside her with one hand touching her arm, and when he woke up in the night, which he still did, still calling out that single word in the dark, she was there. She was always there. And the sound of her voice saying, "I'm here, baby, I'm right here," was the sound of a world being rebuilt from the foundations up. Cade visited every day. He brought coffee and food from the Dusty Wheel diner. Donna had heard the story and had started packing bags of meals without being asked, pressing them into Cade's hands each morning with the quiet fierceness of a woman who expressed care through calories. He sat in the room with Vanessa and Matt, and he didn't say much and he didn't need to. His presence was a form of communication. It said, "I'm not leaving. The door is not going to close. Nobody is going to take this from you." On the third day, Vanessa asked him about himself. Not about the investigation or the club or the rescue, about him, his life, his history. He told her. Not everything. Not the details of his service, not the content of the nightmares, not the particulars of Laura's departure, but the shape of it, the outline, the broad strokes of a man who had come back from war and couldn't find his way home, who had joined a motorcycle club because it was the only family that didn't ask him to be something he wasn't, who had lost his wife and his daily access to his daughter and had filled the void with engine grease and other people's emergencies because his own pain was too large to face directly. Vanessa listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a while. "You sound like me," she said. "How so?" "Carrying something too heavy and refusing to put it down because you're afraid of what you'll be without it." The words sat between them like something solid and true and uncomfortable. Cade looked at her, at this woman who had survived 43 days in a concrete room and still had the clarity to see through a stranger's armor. And he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not attraction, not romance. Something less exciting and more important. Recognition. The recognition of one damaged person by another. The acknowledgement that survival is not the same as healing and that both require company. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." The emergency temporary guardianship was granted on the 5th day. Not for a foster family, for Cade. Graves and a family court judge named Westbrook, a woman with a reputation for prioritizing children's welfare over procedural neatness, had fast-tracked the paperwork. It was temporary. 30 days. Renewable. Enough time for Vanessa to recover and stabilize and begin rebuilding the life that had been stolen from her. When Cade told Matt, the boy looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Does that mean I can stay at the shop? For now? Can I learn to fix motorcycles? If your mom says yes." Matt looked at Vanessa, who was sitting up in the hospital bed for the first time, a real meal on the tray in front of her, color returning to her face in increments so small they were only visible day to day. "Can I?" Matt asked. Vanessa looked at Cade, at the vest, at the man who had knelt in frozen dirt and held her son and ridden through the night to find her. Her eyes were wet, but the tears weren't falling. They were being held, kept, saved for a time when they could fall in private, because even a woman who had been through what she had been through retained the right to choose when her vulnerability was visible. "You can learn to fix motorcycles," she said. The story reached national news on the 7th day. A reporter from a network affiliate drove to Redfield and filmed a segment outside the Iron Circle shop. Cade declined to be interviewed. Preacher declined. Rooster stood in the front bay doorway with his arms crossed and stared at the camera with an expression that made the reporter decide very quickly to shoot the segment from across the street. The attention faded, as attention always does. Within 2 weeks, the news cycle had moved on to other crises and other tragedies and other stories that could be consumed and forgotten. But the legal machinery continued. Grand jury indictments were returned against Caldwell, Kessler, and Harlan. Rebecca Shaw was released from the Indiana Care Facility and returned home. Marcus Trent was taken off the medications that had been used to suppress him and began the slow, painful process of reclaiming his identity. Jorge Elizondo was found in the Eastern facility, alive but in worse condition than Vanessa, and was hospitalized for 2 weeks before being reunited with a family that had spent 14 months believing he had abandoned them. In Redfield, life resumed at the tempo of small-town existence, slow, unremarkable, punctuated by the ordinary milestones that make up a life when it isn't in crisis. Vanessa was discharged from the hospital and moved into a rental house that Preacher's property research friend had found. A clean, modest two-bedroom on a quiet street, paid 3 months in advance by a fund that the Iron Circle had assembled from chapter donations without telling Vanessa, because telling her would have meant she'd refuse, and because some gifts are better given anonymously. She started working again within a month, not at the convenience store, she couldn't go back there, but at a small print shop in Ashburn where the owner, a woman named Gloria, who had followed the case on the news, had offered her a position with the quiet understanding that the schedule would be flexible and the questions would be non-existent. Matt went back to school. This was harder. Children are not kind to difference, and Matt's difference, the missing mother, the foster home, the bikers, the rescue that had been on television, made him conspicuous in a way that he hated. He came home with stories of stares and whispers and questions he didn't want to answer, and for the first 2 weeks Vanessa found him sitting on his bed in the evenings with his jaw set and his eyes distant, retreating into the same armored silence that had sustained him during the 6 weeks of her absence. But children are also resilient in ways that adults forget. By the 3rd week, Matt had a friend, a boy named Lucas, who sat next to him in math, and who didn't care about the news or the bikers or the story because Lucas's primary interest in life was catching frogs in the creek behind the school, and he needed a partner, and Matt was willing. The friendship was uncomplicated and physical and loud, and it pulled Matt out of his head and into the world in a way that therapy and reassurance and good intentions could not. Sometimes healing doesn't come from talking. Sometimes it comes from catching frogs. Cade called Laura on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the rescue. "I want to talk to Mia," he said. "She's right here. She's been asking about you." A pause, then softer. "She saw the news, Cade. Her school friends told her. She knows what you did. She doesn't need to know the details. She doesn't care about the details. She cares that her dad helped somebody. She was proud." Laura's voice caught on the last word. She covered it quickly, the way she always did, with a return to neutral tone. "Hold on." A rustling. Then a voice, high, bright, carrying the particular music of an 11-year-old girl who has been given permission to call her father. "Dad?" "Hey, baby girl. Mom said you found somebody's mom." "I did. We did. A lot of people helped." "Was it scary?" Cade thought about the concrete room, the mattress, the bucket, Vanessa's face in the flashlight beam, the weight of her body when she couldn't stand on her own. "Yeah," he said. "It was scary." "Were you brave?" "I tried to be." "I think you were." A pause. Then, with the devastating honesty of a child, "Dad, can you come see me this weekend? Not at the center, at home." Mom said maybe. Cade closed his eyes. The shop was quiet around him. The wood stove was burning. The coffee was hot. Outside, the evening air carried the first faint suggestion of spring, a softening at the edges, a loosening of the winter's grip that was more felt than seen. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be there." The weekend visit happened. It was awkward and beautiful and imperfect, a father and daughter navigating the space between absence and presence, between what they'd lost and what they might still build. They went for a walk. They got ice cream. Mia asked about the motorcycles, and Cade told her about them. And she asked if she could ride one someday. And he said when she was older, and she said how much older. And he said, "Nice try." And she laughed. The laugh was the best sound Cade had heard in a decade. Laura watched from the porch. She didn't join them, but she didn't leave either. On a cold morning in late March, 6 weeks after the rescue, Cade walked into the Dusty Wheel Diner at 7 a.m. The fog was back. It sat across the highway like a memory of the morning everything had started. The neon sign buzzed against the gray air, its dead letters still unrepaired. The smell inside was the same: burnt coffee, old grease, the faint sweetness of cigarette smoke too close to the door. Donna was behind the counter. She looked up when Cade walked in and poured his coffee before he sat down, the way she always did. The table at the back was occupied. Preacher, reading a newspaper. Rooster, staring out the window at the fog. Jules, spinning his lighter between his fingers. An old habit he'd never broken, and probably never would. Cade sat down. They nodded. No one spoke for a while. The silence was comfortable. The silence of men who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Then the door opened. Matt walked in. Behind him, Vanessa. She looked different from the woman they'd found in the concrete room. Not unrecognizable. The changes were subtle, accumulative, the kind of changes that happen when someone is eating properly and sleeping in a real bed and breathing air that isn't filtered through concrete walls. Her hair was clean and pulled back. Her face had filled out enough that the hollows under her cheekbones had softened. She was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt and a new jacket. Not denim this time, but a dark green canvas coat that she'd bought with her first paycheck from the print shop. She was carrying something, a frame. Matt walked ahead of her to the table and stood there with the quiet confidence of a boy who had been in this room before and knew its rhythms. He looked at each biker in turn, Cade, Preacher, Rooster, Jules, and his face carried an expression that was neither child nor adult, but something in between, something forged in the space where loss and recovery overlap. "My mom wants to give you something," he said. Vanessa stepped forward. She set the frame on the table. Inside the frame was the crayon map, the yellow construction paper, creased and refolded and worn at the edges, the brown roads and the green trees and the blue square at the end of the winding line, the labels in a child's careful handwriting, gas station, bridge, big tree, blue house. And in the corner, in small letters that were barely visible against the yellow, Mama. "I want you to hang this here," Vanessa said. Her voice was clear and steady and carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Not because it's evidence, not because it's history, because it's a map. And it led where it was supposed to lead. Cade looked at the crayon map inside its frame, at the lines drawn by a mother who had known something terrible was coming and had done the only thing she could, left a trail for her son to follow, trusting that, at the end of it, he would find someone willing to listen. He looked at Vanessa, at Matt, at the men sitting around this table in a diner at the edge of a town that the world had forgotten. "Donna," Cade said. "You got a nail?" Donna produced a hammer and a picture hook from behind the counter with the efficiency of a woman who had been prepared for this request without knowing she was prepared for it. Cade stood on a chair and hung the frame on the wall above the back table. The crayon map sat there between a faded beer sign and a calendar from 2 years ago, looking both perfectly out of place and exactly where it belonged. They sat down together, all of them. Donna brought coffee for the adults and hot chocolate for Matt. The mugs steamed. The fog pressed against the windows. The neon sign buzzed, and for a while nobody said anything, because the moment didn't need words. It needed presence. It needed the warmth of coffee held in scarred hands, and the sound of a boy slurping hot chocolate, and the sight of a mother watching her son with an expression that contained every emotion the human face was capable of producing, and a few that hadn't been invented yet. Rooster broke the silence. "Kid still wants to learn about motorcycles." "He does," Vanessa said. "I can teach him to change oil this weekend, if that's all right." "It's all right." Matt's face lit up with a brightness that made the neon sign look dim. Outside, the fog began to thin. Not all at once. Slowly, in layers, the way fog lifts when the morning sun is too persistent to ignore. The highway emerged first, then the tree line, then the fields beyond, stretching out flat and quiet toward a horizon that was just beginning to glow with the first suggestion of warmth. Cade sipped his coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter and stale, the same coffee he'd been drinking at this table for 8 years. It was the best coffee he'd ever had. He looked at the crayon map on the wall, at the word Mama in the corner, at the blue square at the end of the road. He thought about the boy who had walked into this diner on a frozen Saturday morning with nothing but dirty sneakers and hollow eyes and a map drawn by a mother who loved him enough to plan for the worst. He thought about the choices that had followed, each one frightening, each one costly, each one leading to the next like links in a chain that only made sense when you could see the whole length of it. He thought about what Vanessa had said in the hospital. Carrying something too heavy and refusing to put it down because you're afraid of what you'll be without it. He was still carrying things. He would always be carrying things. But the weight had shifted. It was distributed differently now, spread across more shoulders, shared among people who understood that the carrying was not a weakness, but a form of love that had no other way of expressing itself. Preacher caught his eye across the table. The older man gave the smallest nod. Not permission, not approval, just acknowledgement. The nod said, "I see you. I know what this cost. It was worth it." Cade nodded back. Matt finished his hot chocolate and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked at the crayon map on the wall, and his expression, that old ancient expression that had lived in his eyes since the day his mother disappeared, was finally, completely, irreversibly gone. In its place was something new, something that looked like a 10-year-old boy. Just a boy. Sitting in a diner with people who cared about him, drinking hot chocolate on a morning when the fog was lifting and the world, for the first time in a very long time, felt safe enough to simply exist in. Vanessa reached across the table and put her hand over Cade's. Just for a moment, just long enough for the warmth of it to register. "Thank you," she said, "for listening." Cade looked at her hand on his, at the boy beside her, at the map on the wall. "That's all it was," he said quietly. "Just listening." Outside, the last of the fog dissolved. The sun broke through, pale, winter-thin, but steady. The parking lot of the Dusty Wheel Diner held 6 motorcycles, a beat-up sedan, and the particular kind of silence that happens when a story reaches its end and the characters inside it are allowed, finally, to rest. The engines would start again, the roads would call, the iron circle would ride, because riding was what they did and who they were, and the only language some of them had ever been fluent in. But for now, on this morning, in this diner, at this table, they were still. And the crayon map hung on the wall, catching the first light of day, its lines and colors glowing faintly, as if the paper itself remembered the hand that drew it and the love that had guided every stroke. A mother's map, a boy's faith, a brotherhood's choice. Some mornings, that is enough.